Hello and welcome back. Tonight we are going to climb aboard a different kind of vessel than the one you left in your waking life. Tonight, the timber beneath your feet is old oak, bound with iron rivets, and coated in a crust of salt that has hardened overnight into something like frosted glass. The wind moving over this deck has crossed 1,000 miles of open, black water before it ever touched your skin, and it carries with it a cold that does not simply chill you. It settles into you, patient and unhurried, the way only a northern winter sea can manage. You are standing on the deck of a Norse trading ship, somewhere between the fjords of home and a harbor still many days away. It is deep winter, the kind of winter that swallows the sun before it has fully risen and spits it back out again only a few pale hours later. The men around you, sailors, traders, a few warriors among them, have already resigned themselves to a night with no true bed, no roof, and no fire. This was simply what a winter crossing meant, 1,000 years ago, for the people who dared to sail when the rest of the world stayed home by the hearth. Before we drift into their world together, take a slow breath in and let it out even slower. If this kind of long, detailed history journey helps carry you towards sleep, consider leaving the video a like. It costs you nothing and it helps this small channel keep making them. And if you'd like, type in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. I always enjoy reading them in the morning. Now let your eyes close, let the room around you fade, and let the ship carry you forward into the dark. The first thing you notice as you settle low against the planks is how little space there is meant for a body. This ship was built for cargo and speed, not for comfort. Its hull curves in tight along the sides, and the men have wedged themselves into whatever gaps the wood allows against sea chests, along the curve of the ribs, beneath the overhang of the mast step. There is no cabin here, no separate deck below for sleeping, no door to close against the wind. Historians who study these vessels are largely in agreement that Norse ships of this era, whether built for trade or for raiding, simply were not designed with rest in mind. Every plank served the ship's speed and strength first. Whatever sleep the crew managed, they had to steal it from whatever space remained. You watch a sailor near you settle into a hollow between two sea chests, tugging his knees up toward his chest to fit. His cloak, thick and roughly woven, wraps twice around his shoulders, though even doubled it looks thin against the wind. He does not complain. None of them do, not out loud. Complaining was a luxury as scarce as warmth. There is a detail that surfaces sometimes in the old stories, half history and half legend, of sailors using their round wooden shields not for battle, but as makeshift shelter, propping them along the ship's low railing to block a little of the spray and wind while they slept beneath them. It's a clever idea, until you picture the reality of it. A man rolling over in his sleep and striking his skull against the iron boss at the shield's center, waking with a bruised head to go along with his frozen feet. Whether this was common practice or only ever done in a pinch, we cannot say for certain, but it captures something true about this life. Comfort was never really available, only the illusion of slightly less discomfort, purchased at some other cost. You crouch beside one man whose beard has gone stiff and white with frost, each breath rising from him in a pale little cloud before vanishing into the dark. You find yourself wondering, did he actually rest, in any sense that word deserves? Or was this simply the body giving out, collapsing under exhaustion rather than settling into anything like true sleep? It's a question historians still debate. Some argue that these winter voyages permitted only a kind of half-consciousness, a state where the body rested just enough to keep functioning, while the mind stayed tethered to every creak of the hull and every shift in the wind. Others believe that true, if brief sleep was possible, that exhaustion is its own kind of anesthetic, powerful enough to override cold and fear alike, at least for a few hours at a stretch. Your palm finds the deck beneath you, and the wood is rough with dried salt, sharp in places like tiny crystals of broken glass. It rises and falls gently with the swell beneath the hull, almost like breathing, as though the ship itself were some vast, slow creature carrying you across its back. The motion should be soothing. In some strange way, it almost is. But your body has not forgotten the bite of the wind, and no matter how the ship rocks you, the cold keeps finding new paths in through the seams of your clothing. This, you begin to understand, was the quiet truth behind the sagas and songs, not the glory of the raid or the thrill of discovery, but the unglamorous, grinding endurance of trying to sleep while the world did everything in its power to keep you awake. Nearby, two sailors have drawn close together, shoulders pressed so tightly they seem to form one shape beneath their combined cloaks. This was not affection, or not only affection, it was strategy. Shared warmth meant survival. A single body loses heat quickly in weather like this. Two bodies pressed together lose it far more slowly. You hear a low snore rattle out of one of them, followed by a dry cough from somewhere else in the huddle, small reminders that this was a crowded, intimate kind of misery. Nothing at all like the sagas sung on land, with their talk of glory and gold. The ship groans, a wave slaps against the hull, and you let your eyes fall shut, letting the rhythm of water against wood begin to pull you down, the same way it once pulled these men down, into fragments of sleep shorter than the winter nights around them, every heartbeat borrowed against the morning. You blink, and though it is not truly you experiencing this, you find yourself following the sailors deeper into the belly of the ship, into the low, cramped space beneath the working deck, where the hull curves close enough that a grown man must duck and crawl rather than walk. There is no privacy down here, no separation between the space where men worked the ship and the space where they tried, however poorly, to rest. This construction, we know from the wrecks and reconstructions archaeologists have studied, was both remarkably clever and entirely unconcerned with comfort. Norse shipbuilders used what's called clinker construction, overlapping planks, riveted together, flexible enough to bend with the sea rather than fight it. This gave the ship extraordinary strength for its weight, and allowed it to survive open ocean swells as easily as shallow coastal rivers. But nothing in that design considered where a tired man might lay his head. You run your fingers along one seam, feeling the texture of hardened pitch used to seal the gaps, rough and slightly sticky even in the cold. It is ingenious. It is also for sleeping, closer to a coffin than a bed. The air down here is thick, damp wood, fish oil, unwashed wool, and the underlying salt smell that never quite leaves a ship like this. A known detail, confirmed by both archaeological evidence and the accounts of the era, is that Norse longships and knars, the broader cargo vessels used for long trading voyages, had no fixed sleeping quarters at all, even on their largest builds. Men slept wherever the curve of the hull permitted, sometimes stretched across the tops of their own sea chests, which doubled as storage below and a stiff, narrow mattress above. And yet there's a curious thread that runs through some of the old tailies, a claim that certain crews stretched spare sailcloth or hide between the ship's ribs, fashioning something close to a hammock. If such a thing existed, it would have been a rare comfort indeed. A sway within a sway, the body rocked twice over, once by the sea and once by the cloth. Historians remain divided on whether this was ever truly practiced at sea during this period, or whether it is a detail borrowed and embellished from later Mediterranean sailing traditions, where hammocks are much better attested. The truth may simply be lost to time. Here, in this imagined night, nothing about it feels like an exaggeration. You watch a sailor wedge himself into a corner near the hull, pressing his shoulder into the wood, knees drawn tight to his chest. He tugs his cloak closer and tries to ignore the steady drip of condensation falling from the beams above, a slow, irregular rhythm against the back of his neck. He mutters something too quiet to catch, a curse at the cold, perhaps, or a fragment of a prayer. Beside him, another man stirs and rolls closer, until their two cloaks overlap into a single, ragged barrier against the draft. Odd as it sounds, some sailors are said to have carved small notches or hollows into the wood at their sleeping spot, grooves shaped to their hip or shoulder, the way an animal might wear a path through grass over time. You imagine running a finger along such a hollow, wondering how many nights it took to shape it, and how many different backs came to fit that same worn place in the wood. Above you, a rope creaks as though plucked by some invisible hand, and still the men do not stir. Their exhaustion runs deeper than the sound of the ship around them. And yet, even in this state, something in them stays alert. One man's hand rests near the haft of an axe tucked close to his side, fingers curled loosely around it even in half-sleep. Another shifts at the sound of the wind shifting the sail, as though ready to rise the moment a shout comes from above. You press your own palm to the hull, and the cold seeps through instantly, straight into the skin, and you understand in that moment that there was no part of this vessel truly safe from the sea's reach. And still, the men made do. Still they curled into their carved hollows, lay across their sea chests, wrapped themselves in wool like something half mummified. Still they closed their eyes for whatever hours the night allowed, in quiet defiance of the wind's constant howling and the sea's endless restlessness. The night stretches on, and your attention drifts from the hollow spaces between ribs and sea chests to the material draped over every sleeping shape around you, wool. Coarse, heavy, water-darkened wool, wrapped and rewrapped until it becomes less like clothing and more like a second skin. You reach out and touch the edge of one cloak, and it is thicker than you expected, dense with the oils still clinging to the fibers from the sheep it once belonged to. We know from grave finds scattered across Scandinavia that wool cloaks were a staple of Norse dress, woven tightly and often treated with lanolin, the natural grease from the sheep's own coat, left in rather than washed out. That grease is what allowed even a soaked cloak to trap a thin layer of warmth close to the body, the same way a duck's oiled feathers shed water rather than absorb it. It's a small mercy, built into the fabric before it was ever cut and sewn, and it likely made the difference between a miserable night and a fatal one more times than any saga bothered to record. You tug at the edge of a nearby cloak and catch its scent earthy, faintly oily, carrying just a trace of the animal it once protected. There's something strange in the thought that the sheep, in its own quiet way, is still protecting its former shepherd, out here in the middle of a black winter sea, long after the shearing. One detail preserved in fragments of later saga writing suggests that some sailors lined the inside of their cloaks with scraps of fur, rabbit, fox, whatever could be spared, stitched in not for decoration, but simply to dull the scratch of raw wool against skin. Picture it. Night after night of sleeping in something coarse and prickling, until finally you take a knife to some spare hide and tuck it in along the collar and shoulders, turning discomfort into something almost bearable. It's a small, almost domestic gesture, tender in its practicality, even in a setting as harsh as this one. Still, scholars disagree on how far wool alone could carry a man through the worst of these winter nights. Some argue that no matter how tightly woven or well-treated, wool combined with sea spray and driving wind would eventually fail to keep a body warm enough for real rest. Others point to Norse resilience and craftsmanship, arguing that the tight weave turned aside more of the wet than we tend to credit it for today. You watch a sailor pull his cloak higher, until it hides even the lower half of his face, leaving only a thin plume of breath escaping at the edge. And you find yourself wondering, along with the historians, whether the warmth he feels is real, or only the mind convincing the body that it is. The hours pass, and the sounds around you settle into their own rhythm, the mast groaning steadily overhead, ropes humming a high, thin note in the wind, and beneath it all, the constant rustle of cloaks as men shift in their sleep, chasing a comfort that never quite arrives. One man lies with his garment pulled so tightly around him that only the tip of his nose shows. Another sprawls with his cloak spread wide instead, as if daring the cold to do its worst. There's a strange, almost unbelievable practice mentioned in a few scattered pieces of folklore. Sailors said to have soaked their cloaks in seawater on purpose, letting the fabric freeze stiff on deck before crawling beneath it like a hard outer shell. It sounds like madness. Why would anyone turn their only blanket into a block of ice? And yet the logic, however strange, held together. A frozen cloak, rigid as it was, blocked the wind completely, forming a solid barrier rather than a porous one. Whether this was ever truly done, or is simply one of those tales that grows stranger each time it's retold, it's easy to imagine the shiver that runs through you picturing it. Desperation has a way of making even the strangest ideas sound reasonable. You let your fingers brush against one of the cloaks nearby, surprised at how heavy it feels, waterlogged, dense, pressing down like a sandbag rather than resting light like a blanket should. The sailor beneath it stirs, shifting his shoulders slightly, easing the weight rather than escaping it. You wonder whether the cloak is giving him any rest at all, or simply adding one more burden for his tired body to carry through the night. It's worth remembering that wool in this world was a form of wealth. A good, thick cloak represented flocks tended through the year, wool spun by hand over long winter evenings, hours of labor turned into cloth. Aboard this ship, all of that labor became something else entirely, the thin, fragile line between survival and frostbite. The steady creak and hum of the vessel reminds you that luxury out here has nothing to do with silver or gold. It is simply a blanket, rough as bark, wrapped around a shivering body. And still, even bound in wool and huddled against the cold, the mind refuses to stay in the present. Dreams rise up unbidden in these sailors, even now. Perhaps they picture fields where their flocks still graze under open sky, or the low orange glow of a hearth where a mother once tucked blankets tight around them as children. For a moment, the creak of the timbers becomes, in their sleeping minds, the creak of a familiar door, and the smell of the sea fades into the memory of wood smoke and home. But the sea always returns to remind them where they actually are. A wave slaps hard against the hull, sending a fine mist through the gaps in the planking, and you feel it land two sharp, cold points against skin already raw from the wind. The sailor nearest you groans and pulls his cloak tighter, though both of you understand, without needing to say it, that no amount of wool will ever fully keep the sea out. And yet, for another hour, another stretch of borrowed time, he tries anyway, letting the weight and rough comfort of the wool trick his body into believing that rest is possible. Your gaze moves now from the cloaks themselves to the bodies gathered close beneath them, and it becomes clear that the warmth these men depended on was never only in the fabric. It was in each other. When the wind found its way through every seam in the hull, and the planks wept a fine, icy mist onto anyone unlucky enough to lie beneath them, the last true defense left was simple human closeness. You picture the crew arranged shoulder to shoulder, hip against hip, a tangled heap of limbs and cloaks pressed together, not unlike a stack of logs arranged to keep a low fire smoldering through the night. It is well established from what survives of the historical record that Norse sailors rarely slept alone during a winter crossing. The cold could kill, and there was no shame at all in leaning on another man's warmth to survive it. You watch two sailors draw closer still, their cloaks overlapping until they form one single mound, their breath mingling into a shared, visible cloud above them. It looks practical more than affectionate, though after weeks together at sea, the line between the two probably blurred more than either man would openly admit. A curious practice survives in oral tradition, the suggestion that some crews deliberately paired younger sailors with older ones for the night, so that the strength and body heat of youth could support a frailer frame, while the older man in turn offered his years of hard-won knowledge on how best to survive the crossing. It wasn't sentiment. It was strategy folded quietly into the arrangement of bodies on a cold deck. You can almost picture the pairs forming instinctively, the way birds might huddle together instinctively in a storm, without needing to discuss why. Historians remain uncertain whether this was a universal habit or something more occasional, shaped by the particular men aboard a particular ship. Some point to the almost total silence of the written record on the subject as proof that it was simply too ordinary to be worth writing down. Others suggest a more ritualized arrangement, perhaps organized by rank or kinship rather than left entirely to instinct. No firm answer exists. But watching the scene in front of you, the truth feels almost self-evident. In a cold this deep and this relentless, closeness was not comfort. It was survival, plain and simple. You crouch lower, close enough now to hear the shuffle of cloaks as one sailor mutters something in his sleep, his hand fumbling blindly, until it finds another man's arm and pulls it over himself like an extra layer of blanket. The smell around them is heavy, unwashed wool, dried sweat, the faint tang of salted fish clinging to every fold of cloth. But beneath that smell, the warmth radiating from so many bodies packed into so little space is entirely real. You feel your own shoulders loosen slightly, lulled by that steady, shared heat. There's something almost strange in the image before you, hardened raiders and traders, men known in their own time for strength and violence, reduced by night to nothing more than a pile of shivering bodies clinging to one another for survival. But this is so often how history quietly humbles its subjects. Heroes by day, vulnerable, ordinary sleepers by night. And perhaps it's in that vulnerability that they become, if only briefly, more human to us now than any saga alone could make them. You watch the small, clumsy adjustments continue around you, an elbow jabbed into a rib, a muffled curse when someone rolls too far, or tugs the shared cloak unevenly off someone else's shoulder. Small irritations, certainly, but far preferable to freezing alone. A story, likely embellished with each retelling, survives in later folklore of a crew who insisted on singing together before settling down for the night. A low, steady chant meant to bring their breathing into the same rhythm. Once the song faded, they are said to have collapsed together, side by side, their breathing and their eventual snoring falling into the very same tempo, as though the music itself lingered on in their lungs long after the last note. True or not, you can almost hear a faint hum somewhere beneath the groan of the timbers as you sit here now. You press your palm flat against the deck and feel it vibrate faintly under the combined weight of the sleeping men above. The boards themselves are damp and cold beneath your hand, and yet somehow, faintly, warmed by the bodies curled together just above them. That small, stubborn warmth is a reminder that survival out here was never only about axes and shields. It was about skin pressed against skin, heat carried from one chest to another, passed along the length of the ship like something almost sacred. Not every man welcomed this closeness easily. A few of the old tailies hint at sailors stubborn enough to insist on sleeping apart, clinging to some idea of independence, only to end up crawling back toward the group before dawn, shivering too hard to hold onto their pride any longer. The lesson, it seems, came quickly and without mercy. Pride freezes faster than skin ever does. And so, night after night, the huddled mass returned, cloaks spread, bodies overlapping, the cold endured together rather than alone. Outside, somewhere above the huddled shapes, the wind circles the ship like something hunting, restless and endless. Inside, beneath layers of damp wool, the crew sleeps in a tangled knot of arms and shoulders, stubborn in their refusal to give the cold an easy victory. And you, drifting invisibly among them, feel for the first time tonight the strange comfort of that closeness, awkward, unglamorous, but entirely necessary. Your attention shifts, and you notice a faint clatter rising near the base of the mast, not rope, not timber, but the softer sound of wooden bowls knocking gently against one another. Before sleep, it seems, there is one more ritual left to complete: food. You move closer and watch several sailors settle low in the dim light, cloaks pulled tight around their shoulders as they cradle small, worn wooden vessels in their hands. Inside is nothing extravagant: strips of dried fish, softened slightly by a splash of water, perhaps a portion of barley porridge, thick and plain, or a piece of hard bread softened just enough in broth to be chewable. It is modest, almost bland, but enough to quiet the ache of hunger before the long, uncertain hours of half-sleep begin. Archaeological evidence from Norse settlements confirms that dried fish, salted meat, and dense, long-lasting bread formed the backbone of provisions on any extended voyage, foods chosen specifically for their ability to survive weeks at sea without spoiling, even if they hardened to something closer to stone along the way. You watch a sailor gnaw doggedly at a strip of dried fish, the salt sharp enough to make him wince, before washing it down with a mouthful of cold water. The taste means little. What matters is the low, steady warmth that follows, fuel enough to help the body keep fighting the cold through another night. A curious belief survives in the old stories, the idea that it was considered unlucky to fall asleep at sea on an empty stomach, since hunger was thought to leave a man's spirit restless, more vulnerable to nightmares, and to whatever unseen things might be listening in the dark. And so, even when rations ran painfully thin, sailors are said to have forced themselves to eat something, however small, before lying down. You can imagine a single dried herring passed hand to hand among several men, each taking one small bite before settling in, part practicality, part quiet superstition. Historians remain divided on whether any warm food was ever prepared aboard these ships during a voyage at all. Some argue that small, carefully controlled cooking pits, lined with sand or clay, might have been used on the calmest of nights. Others insist the fire risk aboard a wooden ship coated in tar and pitch was simply too great to justify the reward. The debate remains unresolved, but it's tempting to imagine, if only for a moment, a few men huddled close around a carefully guarded ember, sipping something lukewarm and thin, grateful for even that faint suggestion of heat. You crouch beside one sailor as he finishes his portion, wiping the inside of his bowl clean with the edge of his sleeve before tucking the empty vessel carefully against his chest, as though guarding something precious. Nearby, another man murmurs a brief word of thanks to the gods for the meal, however small it was. In that simple ritual, you sense something beyond mere nutrition, a thread connecting body to spirit, one more small anchor helping these men hold together through the night ahead. An odd detail lingers in folklore, sailors said to have carried dried onions or raw garlic aboard, biting into them just before sleep in the belief that the sharp, lingering smell on their breath might ward off sickness. You picture a dozen exhausted men, cloaks drawn tight, breathing out faint clouds of onion into the cold night air, utterly convinced that this small discomfort was protecting them from something worse. Slowly, the sounds of eating fade into quieter sighs of satisfaction, and the rustle of cloaks being drawn close as the men finally begin to settle. You notice the shift in the ship itself, or perhaps only in your own perception of it, a little calmer now, a little more at peace, as though the meal, however plain, has lulled both crew and vessel into a brief and fragile stillness. The salt still lingers faintly on your own tongue, sharp and metallic, but there's a fullness now too, a small warmth spreading from somewhere deep in the stomach outward. Think for a moment of what these men had already survived by this point in their lives: storms, battles, years of hard labor on unforgiving seas, now reduced each night to depending on a scrap of bread and a strip of dried fish to see them safely through until morning. It's a humbling thought, a reminder that survival so often comes down not to grand acts of heroism, but to the simplest of gestures: chewing, swallowing, and letting out one slow, grateful breath before finally allowing sleep to take hold. Your fingers brush against something draped over a nearby sailor's shoulders, and you realize almost immediately that it isn't wool this time. It's heavier, smoother beneath the palm, carrying a faint scent of barnyard and musk that will never quite hold. Animal hide. You lean in closer and catch the faint sheen of fur under the weak moonlight, stiff in places from dried salt spray, yet thick enough to muffle even the sharpest edge of the wind. It is well established, both from burial finds and from scattered saga references, that Norse traders and sailors often carried animal skins on long voyages, not purely as goods meant for sale, but as practical layers of insulation for the journey itself. Cattle hides, reindeer skins, the occasional bear pelt hauled up from the hold and pressed into service the moment the winter sea turned merciless. You imagine crawling beneath such a pelt yourself, the coarse hair rough against your chin, the smell both oddly comforting and faintly offensive at the same time. An intriguing detail preserved in Norse folklore suggests there was genuine disagreement among sailors over how best to wear these hides at night. Some swore by sleeping with the fur turned inward, pressing the soft underside directly against the skin. Others insisted the fur belonged facing outward, better positioned to trap warm air against the body. You can almost picture the low, half-serious arguments that must have broken out on deck. One man turning his hide one way, another flipping his the opposite direction, each entirely convinced of his own method. It sounds almost trivial, until you remember that in weather like this, even the direction of a pelt might mean the difference between frostbite and a functioning hand come morning. Scholars remain divided on just how common these hides actually were aboard a typical ship. Some point to saga descriptions of warriors wrapped in fur as evidence that the practice was widespread. Others argue that hides were bulky, heavy, and took up precious cargo space that could otherwise carry trade goods, meaning they may have been reserved only for the wealthiest or most senior men aboard. No firm consensus exists, but here on this creaking deck, your senses fill in what the record leaves uncertain. The pelts are present, their heavy scent mixing with tar, sweat, and salt into one thick, unmistakable cloud. You shift closer, pressing your own cheek lightly against the edge of one imagined hide. At first it feels cold and stiff, crusted faintly with salt. But slowly, as your own warmth begins to seep into the fibers, it softens, grows pliable, and something like a faint coziness begins to steal through you. In a world defined by icy breath and splintered, damp wood, this small relief feels disproportionately large. One rather unusual detail preserved in a later Icelandic account claims that seal skins were considered the finest bedding available at sea, despite carrying such a strong smell of fish that only the most desperate sailors could bear to sleep beneath them. You can almost picture grown men wincing, burying their noses deep into the fur, gagging faintly at the smell, only to sigh in genuine relief once the warmth finally outweighed the stench. The sounds of the ship seem to shift slightly as you settle beneath the imagined hide. The constant creak of the timbers grows a touch more muffled, as though you've crawled into some small, private cave carved out of the larger vessel. The fur seems to absorb sound the way it absorbs cold, dulling the world to something gentler, though the steady rocking of the ship never stops. Somewhere nearby, you hear a sailor's teeth chatter faintly, followed by the soft rustle of his neighbor shifting a shared hide further over both of them. For all its clumsiness, this small act of sharing forges something as real as any bond built through battle. Your mind drifts along with theirs, and you find yourself wondering, did these sailors dream of the very animals whose skins now covered them? Perhaps of herds moving slowly across snow-covered fields back home, or of hunts remembered in vivid detail, or simply of the trading posts where such hides were once exchanged for silver. The connection between the land they left behind and the sea now surrounding them never fully disappeared, even out here, in the middle of nowhere. The smell of cowhide or reindeer fur carried with it, faintly, the memory of farms far behind the horizon. You tug the imagined hide a little closer, letting the coarse hair scratch lightly against your chin, and understand, finally, that this was never about luxury. It was survival, an old, unspoken pact between sailor and animal, sealed long before either of them ever set foot or hoof upon this ship. Your gaze drifts now toward a faint glint of iron catching the moonlight nearby, not some loose tool left carelessly on deck, but a weapon, an axe, its blade resting close against a sleeping man's side. A little further along, you spot the outline of spears stacked carefully, their wooden shafts braced against the hull. Even here, deep in sleep, the crew never fully separates itself from its arms. Rest aboard a ship like this was always taken with steel kept close at hand. A quiet, constant reminder that safety at sea was never something to be taken for granted. Accounts written by those who encountered Norse raiders and traders often mention this same vigilance, describing men capable of rising from a dead sleep, weapon already in hand, within the span of a single heartbeat. This wasn't simple bravado. It was necessity. Rival crews, sudden storms, unexpected dangers along an unfamiliar coastline, all of it demanded a kind of constant readiness. To be caught unarmed while asleep was to invite disaster, and you can see the proof of that instinct now in the small, unconscious details around you. fingers curled loosely around hilts even in the deepest sleep, twitching faintly, as though the body itself refuses to fully let its guard down. One particularly striking detail appears in later written accounts: the claim that some warriors slept with their weapons deliberately strapped to their wrists, ensuring the blade couldn't be accidentally knocked out of reach during the night. Picture it, lying down to sleep with a knife bound tightly to your forearm, cloak wrapped over the top. Uncomfortable, certainly, but perhaps the sense of security it offered was worth the inconvenience. You can almost hear a faint, occasional jangle of metal each time one of these sleeping men shifts position. Not every historian agrees on how widespread this specific practice actually was. Some argue that simply keeping weapons piled nearby, within an arm's reach, would have been more than sufficient for most crews. Others believe the broader Norse culture of constant readiness ran deep enough that many warriors treated their axes almost like pillows, never willingly letting them out of arm's reach even in their most exhausted hours. Firm evidence remains scarce either way, but watching the crew sleep now, braced quietly against cold steel, the choice in front of you seems almost obvious. Vigilance mattered here every bit as much as warmth. You crouch nearer to one sleeping man, his head resting lightly against the smooth, worn haft of a spear, the wood darkened and softened by years of steady handling. His breath comes out in a low, tired rasp, and yet his arm remains hooked loosely over the shaft, as though even lost in dreams he refuses to let it go. Another man nearby has tucked his axe directly beneath his chest, the cold iron blade pressed flat against his ribs. You wince slightly at the thought of such discomfort, and yet for him, it clearly represents security rather than pain. An old, half-comic memory surfaces from a fragment of saga literature, the tale of a warrior who woke so suddenly and violently during a raid that he swung his axe before he was even fully conscious, striking the mast rather than any actual enemy. His crewmates are said to have laughed and given him a lasting nickname for it, though the splintered wood he left behind told a slightly more dangerous story. It illustrates, in its own small way, just how thin the boundary really was between sleep and readiness aboard a ship like this. How little the mind ever truly allowed itself to rest. The ship creaks again around you, and you find yourself imagining just how easily any one of these ordinary sounds could be mistaken by a half-asleep mind for something far more threatening. The slap of water against the hull, the sharp squeal of straining rope, even the low sigh of the wind through the rigging, all of it could, in the right or wrong state of exhausted alertness, become the first warning sign of danger. Sleep under these conditions was never deep or continuous. It was light, fractured, and endlessly interruptible, always ready to be broken by even the faintest echo of a potential threat. You sense the same tension building faintly in your own body, muscles tightening involuntarily at each unfamiliar creak, never quite allowing yourself to fully surrender to rest. Keeping weapons close also served a second, quieter purpose beyond simple defense morale. To a Norse sailor, strength and readiness were bound up tightly with personal identity. Even asleep, to be found with axe in hand was to remain, in some essential sense, a warrior rather than a helpless victim of circumstance. Perhaps it offered a strange kind of comfort, proof, even in the depths of exhaustion, that these men were never entirely without power over their own fate, no matter how harsh the sea around them became. The faint, metallic smell of iron mingles now with the salt air, sharp and slightly unpleasant, but somehow grounding all the same. You glance across the small collection of weapons scattered among the sleeping men, blades dulled here and there with faint rust spots, spears bristling upward like a row of dark thorns, and you realize this arsenal has become as much a part of their bedding as any cloak or hide. These sailors never had to choose between warmth and vigilance. They clung stubbornly to both, sacrificing softness in exchange for safety. You close your own eyes for a moment, imagining yourself in their place, an axe resting beneath one hand, a damp cloak pulled tight across your chest, the ship rocking steadily beneath you. And in that image, you begin to sense the strange paradox at the heart of it all. Comfort here was never found in letting go, but in holding on just a little tighter, even in the middle of a dream. The sea rocks gently beneath you now, not violently but with a steady, unbroken rhythm, the hull rising, then dipping, each motion like a slow, patient sigh, as though some enormous creature slept just beneath the waves, breathing in time with the ship itself. You begin to realize that for the men who spent their lives aboard vessels like this, that constant rocking motion became both a threat and, strangely, a comfort. At its worst, it threatened to toss an unwary sailor straight into the sea. On calmer nights, though, it lulled the body into something deeper and more restorative than any solid, unmoving bed on shore could ever offer. Modern reconstructions of Norse longships and knars, tested on actual open water, confirm just how agile these shallow-keeled vessels truly were, able to skim across waves almost the way a skater glides across ice. That same agility, though, meant constant motion. The ship was never still, never fully steady beneath the men who called it home for weeks at a stretch. Sleeping aboard meant surrendering, whether willingly or not, to the sea's endless sway. You lie back for a moment yourself, feeling the hard planks press firmly into your shoulders, and slowly the rhythm begins working its way into your bones. Resisting it, you find, is nearly impossible. A curious story survives from a later Icelandic account. A sailor who claimed he could no longer sleep properly on solid land after so many years at sea, insisting the ground itself felt somehow dead and unnatural beneath him. Only when lying in a rocking hammock, he said, could he finally drift into real, restful sleep. It's a strange thought, a life so completely shaped by the rhythm of waves that solid earth itself came to feel foreign and wrong. Experts continue to debate whether this constant rocking motion helped or hindered genuine rest. Some argue that an unsteady, shifting deck would have made truly deep sleep nearly impossible to reach. Others counter that the human body adapts remarkably well over time, gradually sinking into the motion until it becomes as automatic and unnoticed as breathing itself. Watching the sailors around you now, limbs loose, bodies limp, snores rising and falling almost in time with the swell, you find yourself leaning toward the second explanation. All the small sounds around you begin to layer together into something almost musical. The steady creak of oars shifting gently in their bindings, the low, constant hum of rigging vibrating faintly in the wind, the rhythmic slap of waves against the hull below. Together, they form something oddly soothing, not quite a lullaby in the way a hearthside song might be, but the sea's own quiet music working its slow, patient magic all the same. An unusual detail whispered in later folklore claims that some sailors timed their descent into sleep by counting the ship's motion, insisting they could only truly drift off after the vessel had tilted 3 times toward one side and twice toward the other. Superstition, almost certainly, and yet it's easy to imagine lying awake in the dark, silently counting each sway the way a child might count sheep, until drowsiness finally, mercifully arrives. You roll onto your side, mirroring the posture of the men around you, and notice how naturally their bodies seem to curve along with the vessel's motion. One sailor, sprawled near a sea chest, shifts unconsciously with every rise and fall, never fully waking, his arms sliding gently across the boards as though he has repeated this same small dance 1,000 times before. Another snores steadily nearby, his breathing falling into an almost perfect rhythm with the sea itself, as though some unseen hand were playing him like an instrument. It's a striking thought that for these sailors, the very ocean that threatened constantly to capsize their world also, in its own way, cradled them through it. The same force capable of destroying everything also rocked them, however imperfectly, into the only rest available to them. And perhaps in that strange contradiction lies part of the secret to how they endured such voyages at all, fear and comfort tangled together so tightly that eventually the two became almost impossible to separate. Your own eyelids grow heavy. The planks beneath you feel harder than stone, and yet the steady sway above somehow softens the discomfort just enough to bear. You let the motion carry you forward, then back, forward again, until you too begin to feel that same strange lullaby the sea has always sung for the weary. And so the night moves on, not in silence but in rhythm, a song without melody, a cradle without walls, gently rocking each exhausted man who has, for tonight at least, surrendered himself fully to the mercy of the waves. The deck is never entirely still, even now, with half the crew buried beneath cloaks and hides, lost somewhere in uneasy sleep. You shift your gaze toward the bow and find a lone figure standing upright, shoulders hunched hard against the wind, eyes narrowed toward the black horizon. The arrangement is simple, and it repeats itself every single night of the voyage. Some men sleep, while others stand guard, watching for danger the rest are too exhausted to notice. It is well documented, both in saga references and in broader maritime tradition, that Norse crews organized themselves into rotating watches. The reasoning was straightforward. Danger rarely announced itself in advance. A rival ship might appear without warning, a storm could rise suddenly out of a calm sea, or the vessel itself might quietly drift off its intended course while everyone slept. By dividing responsibility and rotating who stood guard, the crew balanced two competing needs at once: the exhaustion building in every man's body, and the constant vigilance the sea demanded regardless. An interesting detail preserved in oral tradition suggests that some sailors actually preferred taking the night watch over attempting sleep on the cold, damp planks below. Standing upright, moving with purpose through the open air, apparently felt less miserable to some than lying rigid and shivering in wet wool. You can almost picture the strange, small comfort of walking a slow, steady path along the deck, stamping your feet occasionally for warmth, rather than twisting helplessly in a half-sleep that never quite arrived. Historians continue to debate how formal this watch system actually was. Some argue there were strict, assigned shifts, with a designated leader choosing specific men for guard duty each night. Others believe the arrangement was far looser, with whoever happened to be most restless simply taking up the task on their own initiative. Without clear written records surviving from the period, the truth likely drifts somewhere between these two possibilities. Watching the tired figure standing alone at the bow now, you find yourself thinking that the precise system probably mattered less than the simple fact that someone always remained awake. The sensation of standing that lonely watch feels distinct, even from where you crouch among the sleepers. The wind cuts directly into the man at the bow, his cloak snapping hard against his legs, while behind him the rest of the ship feels strangely hushed. Snores and long, slow sighs ripple softly across the deck, punctuated occasionally by the groan of timber or the slap of a wave against the hull. His ears strain constantly for anything unusual, the distant crack of oars that aren't his own, the warning cry of a seabird signaling nearby land, the subtle shift of wind direction that might mean a storm building somewhere just out of sight. His task is a lonely one, but it is also, in its own quiet way, a position of real power. For these few hours, the safety of every sleeping man rests entirely in his gaze. An odd superstition recorded in later accounts suggests that some watchmen carried small charms carved with protective symbols, believing these tokens might sharpen their eyesight even through fog or darkness. You picture one man absently running his thumb over a small, worn piece of bone marked with faint carvings, drawing a measure of courage from its presence as the cold steadily wears down his resolve. You crouch lower among the sleeping shapes and notice how completely they trust the man standing watch. Their surrender to sleep is total, unquestioning. One sailor lies curled tightly around his own cloak, mouth slack, snoring lightly. Another shifts and mutters something half-formed in his dream, his axe clinking softly where it rests against the boards. None of them so much as flinch at the ordinary sounds of the sea around them. They rely entirely, completely, on the one or two men still upright near the bow. This rotating system meant that rest, for any single sailor, came only in fragments, perhaps 4 hours at a stretch, often less if a storm demanded every hand on deck. It was nothing like the long, uninterrupted sleep available on solid land, where a body could genuinely reset itself overnight. Instead, it was a patchwork of broken pieces stitched together across an endless string of nights. You find yourself wondering how their minds managed it, how dreams must have fractured into strange, disconnected shards, how the boundary between waking and sleeping must have blurred until the two states began to feel almost indistinguishable from one another. You step a little closer to the watchman himself. His eyes catch faint starlight, and his breath curls upward in pale, steady clouds. He stares not only outward, toward the horizon, but seemingly inward too, perhaps silently counting down the hours until his relief arrives, perhaps repeating old stories in his head simply to stay alert. He shifts his weight, stamping his feet hard against the frost gathering on the deck, muttering a quiet curse at the cold. And yet his eyes never once leave the dark line where sea meets sky. Eventually, another figure rises nearby, stiff and groaning, rubbing hard at eyes still heavy with interrupted sleep. The shift changes. One man lies down gratefully, pulling his cloak tight around himself, while the other rises to take his place at the bow. The cycle continues, relentless, necessary, seemingly endless. For these sailors, sleep was never a private, individual matter. It was a shared, communal arrangement, a constant, careful balancing act between exhaustion and duty. To rest was, in a very real sense, to place your trust entirely in someone else. And to wake was to become, however briefly, the one entrusted with everyone else's safety. The hush of the watch settles gradually into the low, steady rumble of deeper sleep, and you begin to sense what fills these men's minds once exhaustion finally claims them fully. Dreams. Not the polished, heroic visions found in poetry, but something rawer, the desperate, half-formed imaginings of men caught between frost and open sea. Leaning close, you can almost step directly into their sleep, watching eyelids flicker, lips move faintly with half-spoken words. We know from surviving fragments of saga poetry that Norse seafarers frequently spoke, once safely home, of dreaming about the hearth, the smell of wood smoke, the warm orange glow of embers, the distant sound of laughter echoing through a longhouse. You watch one sailor now, his hand curling slightly as though grasping something unseen. Perhaps in his mind, he holds a cup of warm ale, or reaches toward a fire blazing somewhere just out of sight. His breathing softens, and the frost clinging to his beard seems, for a moment, to catch and hold the faint light like tiny embers. A curious belief among later storytellers held that dreams at sea carried real omens. To dream of fire, some claimed, foretold a safe return home. To dream of breaking ice, on the other hand, was taken as a warning of danger still ahead. You can almost hear the whispered exchanges that must have followed each morning, sailors trading fragments of their dreams like small, private tokens, searching for meaning in every flicker of the sleeping mind. Scholars remain divided on how seriously entire crews actually took these dream omens. Some argue they genuinely shaped real decisions, a ship turning back early, or pushing forward despite warning signs, based partly on what a sailor claimed to have dreamed. Others believe such talk was little more than idle chatter, a way to pass the long, dull hours of a voyage. No clear record settles the question either way. But watching the small, unconscious twitch of hands and half-spoken names around you now, you sense just how much weight these dreams genuinely carried in these men's private hearts. The smells surrounding the sleeping crew shift subtly as the night deepens. Cloaks damp with sweat and salt carry a faint, musky trace of the animals whose skins line them, while the sharp brine of the sea itself never fully fades. This particular mixture of scents, familiar and slightly unpleasant all at once, surely worked its way into their dreams as well. Sleeping wrapped in the smell of wool, tar, fish, and unwashed bodies, it's little wonder that visions of open hearths and green summer meadows burned so brightly behind these men's closed eyes. A strange detail preserved in a fragment of Icelandic legal writing describes one sailor who claimed to have dreamed of his wife singing, her voice somehow blending seamlessly with the creak of the ship's mast, so vividly that upon waking he swore he could still hear her voice lingering in the air. Was it pure imagination, or had the groan of straining wood simply twisted itself, in his sleeping mind, into memory and longing? Perhaps it was both. Dreams at sea seemed to have fed constantly on the sounds and sensations immediately surrounding the sleeper, bending them gradually into distant faces and half-remembered voices. You lean in closer toward a younger sailor nearby, his breathing shallow, fingers twitching faintly as though working some invisible loom. Perhaps he dreams of his mother's weaving haul, or of sisters singing together as they spin wool by firelight. Beside him, an older man snores in a low, steady hum, almost like a half-remembered tune even in sleep. Perhaps his dream carries him toward some remembered feast, toward old sagas once sung around a blazing hearth, toward children clambering eagerly onto his lap. Each slow breath seems to carry him a little further from the cold, unforgiving reality pressing in against his skin. Even the ship's constant rocking motion seems to work its way directly into their dreams. You notice how each sleeping body shifts unconsciously with every swell, the rhythm of the sea becoming, quite literally, the pulse beneath their dreaming minds. One man smiles faintly in his sleep, as though gently rocked once more in some long-ago cradle, his mother's hand steady beneath him. The sea, so harsh and unforgiving by day, becomes here at night something closer to a strange and complicated parent. Sometimes cruel, sometimes soothing, but always inescapable. Even you begin to drift along with them, caught somewhere between their private visions and your own. Flickers of warm firelight, the scent of fresh bread pulled from some distant oven. Then the creak of the mast intrudes again, gently reshaping the image into smoke curling instead from a familiar rooftop, distant but somehow still within reach. Out here, dreams blur constantly across the boundary between sea and land, between present misery and remembered comfort. For these sailors, these fragile moments of dreaming were perhaps their only true escape from the voyage itself. By day, they rowed, fought, and endured whatever the sea demanded of them. By night, wrapped in damp cloaks pressed against cold wood and colder steel, they slipped gratefully into worlds far kinder than the ones surrounding them. And even if those visions arrived broken, fractured by hunger or fear, they were treasures nonetheless, carried carefully forward until the light of dawn finally arrived. Your gaze shifts toward the ship's middle section, where the deepest shadows gather, and you notice something oddly absent. No warm, flickering firelight softens the darkness here, the way it might in any home on land. The deck remains dark, lit only by pale moonlight and the faint shimmer of distant stars, and slowly you remember there could be no fire aboard a ship like this, not ever. Historical consensus, supported by both archaeological reconstruction and simple common sense, confirms that open flame aboard a wooden vessel coated heavily in tar and pitch was essentially a death sentence waiting to happen. A single stray ember catching in the rigging could turn the entire ship into a floating torch within minutes. Norse sailors understood this risk intimately, feared it accordingly, and accepted the cost it demanded, nights colder than almost anything a land-dwelling family back home could easily imagine. You wrap your own arms tighter around yourself, feeling the chill deepen without even the small, distant comfort of glowing embers to push it back. A curious observation appears in medieval commentary written by outsiders who encountered these northern seafarers. Foreign traders reportedly marveled that Norse crews could endure such conditions entirely without fire, as though they were something more than ordinary men, beings somehow naturally adapted to cold and darkness alike. The exaggeration carries real awe within it, but likely a kernel of genuine truth as well. Debate continues among modern experts over whether any form of portable heat source was ever attempted aboard these ships. Some experimental archaeologists suggest that small, clay-lined boxes might have provided brief, contained warmth during unusually calm nights. Others dismiss the entire idea as reckless, far too dangerous to justify even in the harshest weather. No physical evidence has survived either way, and so the question remains firmly in the realm of speculation. Here, though, watching frost slowly creep its way across the timbers around you, there is no glow, no spark, only the grim, quiet patience of men who had long since accepted their fireless nights as simple fact. You move closer to a cluster of sleeping men. Their breath rises in small, pale clouds. Their teeth chatter faintly, even deep in dream. One sailor clutches his cloak tighter, muttering something indistinct, while another has burrowed so deeply into his hood that only the very tip of his nose remains visible, raw and reddened by the cold. Above, the mast creaks steadily, a sound that feels somehow more ominous without the soft, familiar crackle of a nearby hearth to balance it. Silence dominates here, heavy and pressing, and yet strangely, even within that silence, small comforts continue to surface. A curious tale from Icelandic folklore describes sailors who claimed the sea itself offered a kind of warmth, insisting that the constant motion of the waves beneath the hull convinced them, on some deep level, that they lay beside some enormous slumbering creature whose body heat rose slowly up through the boards. Surely this was only imagination at work. And yet, shivering here yourself, you understand completely why the mind reaches for such a story. It grasps at any available explanation for why sleep, against all odds, still manages to arrive. You press your palm flat against the deck once more. The wood remains damp, cold, entirely unyielding. And yet the longer you lie there, the more the numbness begins to dull the discomfort, until eventually your own body starts, quietly, to believe its own gentle lie. Perhaps these sailors were right all along. Sometimes comfort is nothing more than stubborn, deliberate imagination, willed into existence out of sheer necessity. The absence of fire meant, too, the absence of everything fire traditionally brought with it. On land, men would gather close around the flames, trading stories, passing cups back and forth, ending each day wrapped in a warmth that settled deep in the chest. Here, there is no circle of firelight, no shifting shadows cast by dancing flame. The only illumination comes from cold, distant stars, and the pale sheen of frost gathering steadily across every surface of wool and wood alike. Sleep arrives here without laughter, without companionship gathered visibly around a shared fire. It arrives alone, largely in silence, almost resigned to its own bleakness. And still they endured. They drew closer together, pulled their cloaks tighter still, and pressed themselves against one another until shared body heat began to mimic, however imperfectly, the warmth of a hearth that could never exist out here. They built, in effect, a living flame made entirely of flesh and breath, sharing warmth in the one place where actual fire could never be allowed to burn. You close your own eyes along with them, the empty dark pressing in close, the cold nipping steadily at your ears. No fire, no embers, nothing but the steady, patient rise and fall of chests around you, a human hearth, built entirely from stubborn will and quiet endurance. And in this particular bleakness, you begin, finally, to understand something of the strange resilience carried by those who once crossed entire oceans with nothing but distant starlight to guide them, and their own bodies, pressed together, as their only true source of warmth. You lean closer toward the planks beneath you, and the sharp scent of mildew rises immediately into your nose. The boards here are damp, always damp, and so are the cloaks stretched out across them. No matter how carefully the men shook their garments out each morning, no matter how long they hung them in whatever weak sunlight the day offered, the sea's breath always found its way back in eventually. You picture yourself lying down into that same wet heaviness, wool clinging cold against skin, sticky with dried brine, never quite drying fully no matter how much time passes. Archaeological evidence recovered from preserved Norse sites shows garments left waterlogged and heavily stained, their fibers stiffened permanently by salt exposure. Scholars broadly agree that during long voyages, clothing rarely had any real chance to dry out completely once soaked. The sea simply wouldn't allow it. Cloaks doubled constantly as blankets, and whenever they absorbed spray, sweat, or rain, they became clammy, heavy burdens rather than sources of comfort. You trail a hand across one such cloak nearby, and it gives faintly beneath your fingers, almost as though the fabric had taken on some strange life of its own. An unusual practice hinted at in scattered folklore suggests that some sailors deliberately soaked their cloaks fully, then wrung them out hard before bedding down, believing that freshly wrung wool somehow insulated better than fabric left only partially damp. Picture it, twisting the fabric until your own hands ache from the effort, only to then wrap yourself in the very same dripping material moments later. Strange logic, certainly, and yet perhaps in a world this desperate it made a certain kind of sense. Researchers disagree on just how severe this constant dampness truly was in daily practice. Some argue that steady wind exposure likely dried garments faster than we tend to assume today. Others insist that moisture in the North Atlantic winter lingered stubbornly in every seam, refusing to fully clear no matter the conditions. The truth likely sits somewhere between these two positions. But standing here now, among these shivering men, you understand the sensation firsthand, a permanent, low-grade clamminess, cold as an unwelcome hand pressed flat against your spine. You hear the sailors shifting restlessly around you. One coughs, his throat clearly raw from the constant damp air. Another scratches irritably at his chest, where salt-stiffened wool rubs uncomfortably against bare skin. The smell surrounding them is unmistakable must, rot, brine, and sweat, all tangled together into one thick, inescapable cloud. Even sleep offers no real escape from it. Their dreams, surely, carry traces of that same smell along with them. An odd tale recorded in later storytelling describes sailors joking darkly that their cloaks had begun growing scales, like fish, after enough weeks at sea, the salt crystallizing across the fabric until it seemed almost alive. The joke carries a grain of literal truth. You glance down and catch faint crystals sparkling in the pale moonlight, sharp as tiny shards of glass, glittering wherever spray has dried unevenly across the wool. This is not soft bedding by any stretch of the imagination. It is closer to rough armor, functioning as both shield and quiet torment at once. And yet, the misery never stops these men from reaching for these same damp garments, night after night. What other choice do they realistically have? One sailor pulls his soaked cloak tighter around himself, apparently choosing to simply ignore the smell entirely. Another rolls onto his side, pressing his face directly into fabric that reeks unmistakably of the sea, as though by leaning further into the discomfort he might somehow make a kind of peace with it. Their bodies adjust slowly, over time. Tolerance builds. What once felt genuinely unbearable eventually settles into something closer to routine. The sound of waves against the hull seems amplified somehow in this damp air, as though the sea itself has crept directly into every fold of cloth surrounding you. The deck beneath your palm feels slick, almost slimy to the touch, leaving a faint wet mark wherever you rest your hand. And still, the men sleep not deeply, not with any real comfort, but enough to restore some small fraction of their strength. You imagine their genuine relief upon finally reaching shore, stripping off these same soaked cloaks, spreading them out before a real fire until steam rises visibly from the drying wool. Perhaps the smell never fully left the fabric even then, but the memory of true warmth would surely have made even that lingering misery worthwhile. For now, though, no such luxury exists. They lie cocooned in dampness, allowing sheer exhaustion to drown out whatever discomfort remains. You pull an imagined cloak over your own shoulders, feel its wet weight settle heavily against you, and surrender to the same uneasy rest they have already found. The night stretches on, and you begin to notice how strangely time itself seems to behave out here on the open sea. On land, winter nights eventually give way to morning, and people wake refreshed after long, uninterrupted stretches of warm sleep. Out here, though, rest arrives only in scattered fragments, constantly broken by watch rotations, sudden waves, and unrelenting cold. For sailors trapped aboard these long winter voyages, entire weeks seem to blur together, until each night begins to feel almost identical to the one before it. an endless cycle of exhaustion followed by bare survival. Historical estimates, along with details drawn from the sagas themselves, remind us that Norse expeditions could stretch on for months at a time, sometimes lasting the better part of half a year, depending on distance traveled and weather encountered along the way. Sailing from Scandinavia toward Greenland, or across toward distant trading posts further west, meant enduring not merely one or two especially difficult nights, but entire seasons of damp planks and shivering, sleep-starved bodies. You imagine lying down for perhaps the 20th time in the exact same damp cloak, on the exact same narrow stretch of board, your back aching in precisely the same spot as always. The sheer monotony itself becomes its own particular kind of torment. A curious remark preserved within saga literature hints that some sailors eventually lost track of the days entirely, marking time only by the steady rotation of watches and the careful rationing of food. The voyage, as far as their day-to-day experience was concerned, reduced itself to little more than waking, sleeping, eating, and rowing, over and over, in an unbroken loop. You sense that same dull sameness settling in around you now, the deck perpetually wet, the air perpetually sharp, the sea below perpetually groaning against the hull. Modern historians continue to debate exactly how these crews managed the sheer mental strain of such prolonged monotony. Some argue that storytelling and shared song helped preserve a kind of collective sanity throughout the voyage. Others believe it was simply the steady, repetitive rhythm of physical labor itself, row, eat, sleep, row again, that gradually numbed the mind into quiet acceptance. No clear answer exists, only the enduring mystery of men who somehow adapted to a level of crushing repetition that would likely break most people alive today. You watch one sailor roll onto his side, groaning softly, his hand instinctively reaching for the same familiar spot on his chest where he tucks his axe every single night. Another shifts his weight to wedge his shoulder against the same section of mast he has claimed, apparently, for weeks running. Their habits have hardened into something like personal ritual, small anchors holding them steady against the surrounding chaos. Even in complete exhaustion, this quiet repetition seems to offer its own strange comfort. This is my spot. This is how I sleep. This is how I wake again tomorrow. An unusual anecdote drawn from later folklore describes an entire crew who apparently claimed, after enough repeated nights of shared hardship, to have started dreaming the exact same dream together, each man independently reporting visions of the very same great hall, complete with roaring fires and a waiting feast. Coincidence, most likely, or perhaps genuine proof that relentless, shared monotony had somehow begun shaping even their private dreams into something uniform. You smile faintly at the thought, hardened warriors and traders by day, unwittingly united dreamers by night. The sounds of this endless voyage continue pressing in around you. Snores rise and fall in rough synchrony with the ship's steady rocking. Somewhere, a man coughs, phlegm rattling faintly in his chest, before settling back into uneasy silence. The deck creaks in a rhythm you now recognize almost instinctively, as though the ship itself endlessly repeats the same single refrain. You realize how quickly familiarity, even here, breeds its own strange form of peace. Even genuine misery, given enough repetition, eventually becomes predictable. And within that predictability, however grim, lies a real form of endurance. Your own body has begun, almost without your noticing, to mirror theirs, knees drawn up, arms tucked in, cloak adjusted in exactly the same way as before. The repetition itself becomes strangely calming, even as it grows increasingly tedious. Perhaps this, in the end, is the true secret behind surviving these endless winter crossings. You stop expecting genuine comfort and instead settle simply for sameness. The weeks stretch onward ahead of these men. The ship will not change. The sea shows no signs of relenting. The planks beneath them will never grow any softer. And yet, each night, the crew surrenders a few more precious hours to sleep, proving again and again that human will can adapt itself even to the bleakest imaginable circumstances. Lying among them now, you begin to understand how they endured not merely individual nights, but entire seasons afloat, half asleep, half awake, always pressing steadily forward into whatever uncertainty still waited ahead. The heavy monotony of the voyage presses down, but just before true sleep finally claims the crew, the men occasionally create a small ripple of change. You hear it begin as a low murmur, almost swallowed entirely by the constant creak of the ship. Then a second voice joins in, then a third, until the deck itself seems to hum quietly with something like song, offered up just before sleep finally takes hold. This, it seems, is their own private comfort, their own quiet ritual, not the loud, roaring chants of battle, but hushed fragments of old sagas, half-remembered verse, lullabies disguised carefully as epic tale. It is well established through surviving saga literature that Norse culture was steeped deeply in oral tradition. Every great hall back home rang regularly with poetry. Every family carried its memories forward through spoken verse, passed down across generations. Out here, far from any hearth or gathered audience, that same practice quietly continued. Men murmured half-remembered lines recalling old gods and heroes, or slowed familiar work songs down into something closer to a drowsy melody. You catch the uneven, sincere cadence of it now, weaving faintly through the surrounding darkness. A curious note preserved in folklore suggests some crews genuinely believed that singing before sleep helped ward off whatever unseen spirits might be lurking out in the waves. A verse recalling Thor's hammer, for instance, might double simultaneously as entertainment and quiet protection. You picture a sailor pulling his cloak tighter as he whispers a few lines about the hammer shattering giants, half convinced that its distant echo might strike down both frost and fear together. Specialists remain far from unanimous on exactly how widespread this particular practice truly was. Some point to surviving fragments of verse as evidence that nearly every voyage included some form of shared song. Others caution that genuine silence may have actually been more common overall, with only certain crews indulging regularly in this kind of ritualized singing. The lack of any conclusive record leaves the question genuinely open, but listening now to the hushed, overlapping chorus drifting quietly across the deck, the practice feels entirely plausible. The sound itself seems to soothe even the most restless among them. A sailor shivering near the base of the mast closes his eyes more easily as the overlapping voices wash gently over him. Another shifts position, murmuring the final line of some half-remembered saga almost like a private prayer, before finally settling fully into sleep. The songs do nothing at all to banish the cold, but they do seem to wrap the mind in something comfortingly familiar. For a brief moment, the ship feels less like a drifting coffin lost on black water, and more like some distant hall gathered quietly beneath open stars. An odd anecdote preserved in later retellings describes one particular crew who reportedly sang unusually bawdy verses before bed one night, laughing loudly despite the frostbite creeping steadily into their fingers. Their laughter, the story claims, grew so loud that it seemed almost to offend the sea itself. A sudden storm rose shortly afterward, and the crew apparently swore never again to mock the waves so openly with careless laughter. You picture the noticeably quieter mood the following night, men whispering only solemn, respectful verses this time, wary of drawing the sea's attention too closely a second time. The sensory details around you shift subtly as the singing continues. The groan of the timbers seems to settle into rhythm alongside the overlapping voices. The splash of water against the hull becomes something like quiet percussion beneath it all. Even the whistling wind moving through the rigging seems, for a moment, to fall into harmony. Briefly, the entire vessel feels almost like a single, strange instrument, carrying this fragile lullaby forward into the cold night. You notice the voices gradually beginning to fade, one by one. A line left unfinished as one man simply drifts off mid-verse. Another hums softly for a while longer, until snoring quietly replaces the melody altogether. What remains afterward is only a fragile, lingering echo, a song slowly dissolving into shared dreams. The silence that follows feels somehow different from before, less bleak, almost sacred, as though the night itself has been briefly blessed by the verse just offered up. Your own chest loosens slightly. You imagine joining in yourself, perhaps clumsily, slightly off-key, but enough to add your own voice to the current passing through the group. The act itself seems to matter less for its sound than for what it represents, a small reminder that you remain part of something larger, a long, unbroken chain stretching all the way from distant farmsteads to this cold, drifting sea, connecting ancestors long gone to the men gathered here now. The song fades away completely. The men lie fully asleep now, mouths slack, cloaks pulled close around them. The ship continues its steady creak. The sea murmurs quietly beneath it all, but the faint memory of those spoken words seems to linger a little longer in the surrounding air. And you, lying among them, feel the quiet comfort of that shared ritual, proof enough that, even during the harshest possible nights, some small space remains for beauty, however brief, before everyone finally surrenders fully to sleep. The songs fade fully into silence, and the night seems to grow colder still around you. You pull your own imagined cloak tighter, though the rough wool scratches uncomfortably at your neck, and you notice your toes have gone entirely numb despite every layer wrapped around them. For the Norse sailors surrounding you, this particular numbness was never a minor discomfort. It was a genuine, looming threat. Frostbite, the kind of danger that crept in slowly and quietly, claiming fingers and toes long before dawn ever arrived to reveal the damage. Both climate studies and surviving skeletal remains confirm that voyages into the North Atlantic exposed crews to genuinely freezing conditions capable of causing permanent injury. Even during summer crossings, these northern seas carried a real bite. In winter, the risk of frostbite became a constant, unrelenting presence. You glance toward a sailor nearby whose cloak has slipped slightly, exposing one bare hand, fingers noticeably pale, nails beginning to darken faintly at the edges. He stirs after a moment, pulls the hand quickly back beneath the fabric, and presses it firmly against his own chest for warmth. An unusual measure mentioned occasionally in scattered folklore suggests that some sailors smeared rendered animal fat directly onto their extremities before settling down to sleep, believing it might help seal in what little warmth remained. Picture it, rubbing tallow into your own toes, the smell thick and unpleasant, the grease clinging stubbornly, before wrapping everything in already damp wool, and simply hopping the combination might hold the worst of the frost at bay. It sounds unpleasant, certainly, and yet perhaps it genuinely spared a few unlucky sailors from waking to find their skin gone entirely numb and dead. Experts remain divided on how effective these makeshift protections could have actually been in practice. Some argue that the fat likely did offer real, if modest, insulation against biting wind. Others suggest it may have simply attracted unwanted vermin, or worn away too quickly against damp, salt-crusted boards to matter much at all. Without any conclusive proof either way, the practice remains speculative, though vividly plausible. You study the faces of the men around you now. Their breath rises in pale clouds above them. Their eyelids twitch faintly as they drift somewhere between waking and dream. One stirs with a low groan, curling his body tighter, as though some deep instinct within him understands that stillness itself carries real danger. Movement, even during sleep, keeps blood moving, keeps a body alive. You understand the same instinct rising in yourself. Stretch the toes, flex the fingers, shift your weight. Do anything at all to keep the cold from finally claiming them. An odd detail preserved in a fragment of saga writing describes a man who apparently woke screaming one night, convinced in his dream that his own feet were burning, only to discover upon waking that frostbite had already numbed them completely. His companions are said to have rubbed furiously at his legs, desperately trying to restore some feeling. Dream and reality had blurred together until pain and cold tangled indistinguishably, the body itself seemingly betraying its own owner. You shiver faintly at the thought, quietly grateful that your own toes, at least in this imagined moment, still ache with something like life. The ship itself offers little real mercy here. Frost gathers steadily along the edges of every plank, glittering faintly under the pale moonlight. You trace the crystals lightly with your fingers, sharp as tiny blades, and wonder how many sailors woke over the years to find frost patterns pressed faintly into their own exposed skin. The cold leaves its mark here even during sleep. And yet, despite the very real threat surrounding them, you watch one sailor shift closer still to another nearby, their cloaks overlapping, feet pressed directly together. Shared warmth once again becomes deliberate strategy rather than simple comfort, the heat from one man's legs potentially meaning the difference between numb, aching toes and toes lost entirely. You close your own eyes and try to imagine yourself fully among them. Your fingers tingle painfully. Your breath burns faintly with each inhale. Your body fights instinctively against the creeping numbness settling in. You understand, somewhere deep down, that surrendering too fully to sleep, letting yourself drift too far beneath its surface, might mean never waking again. And yet exhaustion remains stronger than fear. You feel your own muscles loosen despite the obvious danger, lulled steadily by the sea's constant rhythm. This is the cruel paradox at the very heart of frostbite at sea. To rest is to risk freezing, but to remain constantly awake is simply to exhaust the body toward eventual collapse regardless. And so, night after night, these sailors gambled quietly with their own safety, lying somewhere between warmth and death, trusting entirely in wool, in shared hides, in one another, and perhaps in some quiet corner of their minds in the old gods as well, to carry them safely through until morning. The night grows heavier still, and you notice something curious among the sleeping men around you. Not everyone here has settled for sleep relying solely on cloaks and shared hides. A few sailors clutch small objects tightly in their closed hands, or wear simple trinkets tied on leather cords around their necks, tiny carved charms, crude amulets, small bones etched faintly with runes. These, you realize quickly, are not mere decoration. They are talismans, quiet companions meant to hold back fear while sleep slowly approaches. Archaeological finds recovered from Norse burial sites frequently include small personal pendants, Thor's hammer cast carefully in bronze, animal teeth strung together on cord, polished stones marked faintly with runic scratches. On land, these objects spoke primarily of personal faith and cultural identity. Aboard a ship like this one, though, they seemed to take on an additional role, becoming something closer to a shield against the unknown. The sea here was vast, genuinely merciless, and largely unknowable. To close one's eyes without some small charm close at hand must have felt, to many of these men, uncomfortably close to walking unarmed directly into battle. You lean in closer and notice one sailor's fingers curled tightly around a smooth, worn piece of bone, its surface etched faintly with markings you can't quite make out. He sleeps somewhat more soundly than those around him, as though the small object genuinely anchors him in place. A curious belief recorded in later folklore held that such charms could help keep nightmares themselves from crawling aboard alongside the frost. A carved hammer, some believed, might shatter a coming bad dream outright. A carved fox bone, perhaps, granted the wearer some added cunning, useful for slipping past whatever restless spirits lingered out in the surrounding mist. You picture the quiet comfort of gripping such a token tightly, its edge pressing firmly into your palm, a small reminder that even here, even now, something, whether gods, luck, or simple stubborn belief, stood quietly guard over your sleep. Not every scholar agrees on how seriously these charms were genuinely taken by the men who carried them. Some argue they functioned mostly as symbolic gestures, offering little more real comfort than a child's favorite blanket might. Others believe these small objects carried genuine religious weight, deeply intertwined with broader ritual and belief. The full truth likely rests somewhere between these two positions. But watching these men shift restlessly in their sleep, hands never straying far from their chosen charms, you sense that the underlying belief itself was, at the very least, entirely real to them. The surrounding air seems to hum faintly with the strangeness of these small objects. One sailor mutters quietly in his sleep, words half prayer, half fragment of forgotten song. Another scratches absently at his own chest, apparently checking that his pendant hasn't slipped loose during the night. You sense, in that small gesture, something reaching beyond the ship itself. Not necessarily divine, exactly, but born clearly from a very human need to find meaning amid genuine uncertainty. An unusual tale, retold for generations afterward in Iceland, describes a sailor said to have carried a raven's claw tied around his neck. His companions apparently mocked him for it, claiming he smelled faintly of carrion, but he insisted the claw somehow kept him alive by warning him, through his dreams, of coming storms. When he alone survived a shipwreck that later claimed several of his companions, the story reportedly spread quickly, and for years afterward, other men are said to have tied small bird bones to their belts before sleeping at sea themselves. True or not, the tale lingers, sharp and faintly unsettling, much like the claw itself must have felt against bare skin. The overall atmosphere on deck shifts subtly as you focus in on these small, personal tokens. It isn't only the cold and constant rocking shaping how these men slept, but also this intangible weight of shared belief. Each small charm seems to whisper its own quiet reassurance. You are not alone out here. You remain guarded. Your nightmares, whatever they may bring, cannot fully win tonight. In that quiet conviction, these men seem able, at least briefly, to release enough of their fear to finally close their eyes. You imagine yourself lying among them now, clutching some small charm of your own, perhaps a smooth stone carried up from some distant shoreline, still somehow holding the memory of solid land within it. You roll it slowly between your fingers as you drift, and the surrounding sea feels, just slightly, less hostile for it. Symbols carry real power here, not necessarily because of what they physically are, but because of what these men have chosen to believe about them. Around you, the crew settles deeper into sleep, their charms resting quietly against skin, bone, and worn wood alike. Faith, whether in old gods and small trinkets or simply in stubborn personal superstition, has built them together, a fragile kind of fortress against the surrounding night. And within that fortress, however uneasy, real dreams finally seem able to arrive. The deck feels quieter now, though the steady creak of timber never fully fades away. You shift slightly and catch a new sound entirely, a faint scurrying somewhere beneath the planks. At first you assume it's simply the hull groaning again, but then the sound repeats itself, quick and unmistakable, tiny claws scraping steadily across bare wood. Rats. You peer toward the surrounding shadows and spot small shapes darting swiftly along the deck's edges, disappearing through narrow cracks, apparently bold enough to share this vessel comfortably with the men aboard it. Archaeological digs conducted at old Norse harbor sites and ship burials alike have uncovered rodent remains, confirming what common sense already suggests on its own. Wherever grain, dried fish, and animal hides were stored in bulk, vermin inevitably followed close behind. Norse ships were certainly no exception to this pattern. You imagine barrels of dried fish stacked deep in the hold, sacks of grain lashed tightly nearby, the surrounding smell naturally attracting creatures that required no formal invitation to move in. These sailors endured, it seems, considerably more than simple cold and damp. They endured, too, the constant, unwelcome company of small stowaways armed with sharp little teeth. An unusual detail preserved in Norse anecdote claims that some sailors genuinely believed rats served as omens of coming fortune. If the creatures scurried forward toward the ship's prow, favorable weather was said to lie ahead. If they instead retreated backward, a coming storm was assumed. Superstition, clearly, gave meaning to what would otherwise be simple annoyance, turning unwelcome pests into unwilling little messengers. You picture sailors craning their necks curiously, tracking these small scurrying shapes as though they were minor prophets dressed in fur. Scholars remain uncertain overall about just how significant a nuisance rats truly posed during these longer voyages. Some believe their numbers stayed relatively limited, surviving only on scattered scraps. Others argue that genuine infestations could grow quite severe, gnawing steadily through stored provisions and even chewing directly through valuable rope. The lack of firm evidence leaves the exact scale of the problem genuinely open to question, though the sounds surrounding you now make the underlying annoyance entirely undeniable. The scratching continues steadily, forming a faint, constant background chorus beneath the sea's own rhythm. You watch one sailor shift suddenly in his sleep, slapping blindly at his own cloak where a rat's whiskers have apparently brushed against his hand. He groans, rolls heavily onto his other side, and mutters a curse under his breath, even while still mostly asleep. Nearby, another man kicks out sharply, startling some scurrying shape into a brief squeak before it vanishes entirely beneath the boards. Their rest, already fragile, is interrupted here not only by cold and constant waves, but by these tiny, uninvited invaders sharing their same cramped, narrow space. An odd tale from later folklore imagines sailors occasionally training small ship's cats to help hunt down rats during longer voyages, though the practical reality of this remains genuinely questionable. You smile faintly at the image, some fierce raider gently stroking a half-starved cat curled beside him, both creatures relying quietly on one another for company through the long night. Whether real or simply a later embellishment, the idea softens, if only briefly, an otherwise fairly grim picture. The smell itself confirms the underlying truth well enough. Amid the surrounding tang of salt, tar, and heavy wool, there lingers a faint, sour undertone, the unmistakable scent of a rodent nest tucked somewhere nearby. You wrinkle your nose slightly, though the surrounding sailors sleep on regardless, simply too exhausted to care much either way. Over time, it seems, this particular irritation folds itself neatly into the broader landscape of hardship, becoming just one more small burden woven into the fabric of ordinary survival. The rats themselves, for all the trouble they clearly cause, seem to serve one further oddly reassuring function. They remind you that life, in general, clings stubbornly to existence, even in the harshest possible surroundings. As the sailors around you shiver and mutter quietly through their dreams, these small creatures continue thriving regardless, adapting easily to darkness and damp in a way that seems, in its own small way, almost as impressive as the sailors' own endurance. Perhaps, on some level, these men even envied the rats slightly, since the creatures never appeared troubled at all by frostbite or damp wool. You shift back down among the sleeping shapes once more. The faint scratching continues steadily nearby, though by now it seems to have folded itself naturally into the surrounding symphony, waves, creaking timber, scattered snores, and the soft scurry of small unseen paws, all blending together into one continuous sound. The sailors twitch occasionally, stirring faintly, but never rise fully awake. Even amid this small nuisance, sheer exhaustion continues to win out. Sleep, however restless and interrupted, always finds its way through in the end. Eventually, the rats retreat further into the shadows, and the deck settles back once more into an uneasy, fragile quiet. Overhead, the clouds begin to thin, and a pale wash of silver light spills gradually across the surrounding water. Moonlight. You tilt your head upward and notice how even the sailors, half buried in their restless sleep, seem drawn to it. Their eyes flicker open briefly, drawn instinctively toward the horizon, where the sea now glimmers faintly like polished steel. A few men linger a moment longer in that quiet light, staring upward as though the moon itself had been hung there purely for their benefit. It is well established through surviving saga poetry that both moon and stars once guided Norse voyages across open water. Without them, sailors would have found themselves essentially blind on the winter sea. The moon, in particular, meant far more than simple illumination. It offered orientation, quiet reassurance, and at times something close to companionship out on the open water. You picture a tired sailor lifting his head slightly from a damp cloak, squinting toward the horizon, sighing softly as the pale glow reminds him, if only briefly, that the world extends beyond this narrow deck and the darkness surrounding it. A curious fragment preserved in Icelandic folklore claims that some sailors genuinely believed the moon itself was a shield held aloft by Thor, its bright face offering quiet protection against whatever spirits might lurk in the depths below. To sleep beneath such a sky, in this belief, was to rest under a kind of divine watch. You imagine the comfort this thought must have offered, silver light glimmering steadily across black water, believed, however briefly, to promise safety. Scholars remain divided on whether such beliefs ever genuinely shaped real navigational decisions, or whether they existed purely as poetic flourish layered over more practical astronomy. Some argue that sailors relied almost entirely on careful, practical star reading. Others believe faith and observation were, in this culture, largely inseparable, each reinforcing the other rather than competing. The precise distinction hardly seems to matter as you watch the scene unfold now. The moon glows steadily overhead. The sea glimmers quietly below, and tired, weathered men draw whatever hope they can from the simple sight of it. A sailor near you rolls onto his back, eyes opening just enough to take in the pale sky above. His breath rises slowly, fogging faintly, and his lips curve into the faintest suggestion of a smile. The moonlight seems, for a moment, to smooth away some of the deep exhaustion lining his face. Another man stirs nearby, pulling his cloak tighter still, though he leaves one hand exposed, fingers twitching faintly as though reaching instinctively toward the pale light above. They may never speak of it aloud come morning, but the moon seems to work its way quietly into their dreams regardless, etched somewhere alongside all the rest. An unusual detail preserved in oral tradition claims that some crews time their sleep according to the moon's changing phases, believing that new moons brought restless, difficult nights, while full moons offered something closer to genuine peace. Perhaps this was pure superstition, or perhaps the simple additional light genuinely eased anxious minds enough to matter. You notice tonight's steady glow softening the shadows around you, edges growing less sharp, less threatening, and find yourself wondering whether you, too, might sleep somewhat easier beneath such silver light. The whole atmosphere aboard shifts subtly with the moon's rise. The deck feels marginally calmer now, the sea gentler, though both remain, in truth, exactly as dangerous as they were before. The light simply fools the senses into something resembling peace, and the sailors seem entirely willing to accept that gentle illusion. For men pushed this far past ordinary exhaustion, even a small glimpse of beauty seems enough to help carry them toward sleep. The moon fades slowly behind drifting clouds, and the deck sinks back once more into shadow. As the surrounding silence thickens, you find yourself wondering, alongside generations of historians before you, exactly how these sailors truly arranged themselves for rest each night. Did they simply collapse wherever exhaustion happened to strike first, or was there some established order, certain places claimed and routines quietly followed? The question lingers, unresolved, for researchers who have long tried to reconstruct precisely how men actually slept aboard these narrow, unforgiving vessels. Archaeological excavations of Norse ships reveal no fixed bunks anywhere aboard. These longships, built primarily for speed and shallow water agility, left essentially no room for private sleeping chambers. Unlike the later medieval trading vessels of southern Europe, these Norse ships were stripped down to their essential frame, little more than a floating skeleton of planks and beams. And yet, scattered fragments of woven matting, along with occasional descriptions found within the sagas, hint at some degree of improvisation. Did sailors spread thin mats directly onto the open deck, or did they simply sleep across the tops of their own sea chests instead? The available evidence remains suggestive rather than conclusive. Some modern scholars argue that mats woven from straw or rushes must have been carried aboard, providing at least a thin cushioning layer between sailor and bare plank. The reasoning here seems straightforward enough. Even the hardiest crew would likely struggle badly across weeks of unbroken exposure to bare, unyielding wood. Others caution, though, that cargo space aboard these vessels was extremely limited, and that any such mats would have quickly soaked through with salt spray anyway, transforming quickly from useful bedding into another soggy burden. The debate, much like the sea itself, shows little sign of settling. One especially curious detail surfaces occasionally in later folklore: sailors reportedly slinging spare rope or leftover sailcloth between the ship's internal ribs, forming a rough approximation of a hammock. If true, this would represent a genuinely remarkable innovation, appearing centuries before hammocks became more broadly common across European seafaring tradition. Some experimental archaeologists have even tested this theory directly, stringing cloth across faithful replica longships to see how it performs. The results, by most accounts, prove workable if somewhat awkward. Sleep becomes marginally easier, though balance grows correspondingly more precarious. Still, no direct physical evidence has ever surfaced to confirm the practice definitively, leaving the entire idea suspended somewhere between plausible history and tempting speculation. The sailors you observe now seem entirely unconcerned with any of this ongoing scholarly debate. One sprawls awkwardly atop a sea chest, head tilted back at an uncomfortable angle, his cloak draped loosely over him like a half-collapsed tent. Another wedges himself directly against the curved hull, his body bent to match its natural angle, almost as though shaped deliberately by the vessel itself. Their choices here are entirely pragmatic, guided far more by simple fatigue than by any particular theory. Wherever exhaustion finally caught up with them, that spot simply became their bed for the night. An unusual tale preserved from Iceland describes an entire crew who reportedly argued regularly over which sections of deck offered the flattest, most comfortable planks, drawing lots each evening to settle the dispute fairly. You smile faintly at the underlying pettiness of it all: hardened warriors who faced down storms and open battle by day, quarreling instead like squabbling children over stretches of bare wood once night fell. And yet the story rings entirely true regardless. Discomfort has a way of magnifying even the smallest available mercy, until it starts to feel, by comparison, almost like genuine luxury. You shift closer, pressing your own palm briefly against the curved hull nearby. The wood remains cold, curved, entirely unyielding beneath your touch. Imagine resting your back directly against it for hours on end, the resulting ache slowly working its way deep into your bones. It's little wonder these sailors improvised constantly, stuffing spare cloaks beneath themselves for padding, stacking shields for support, even repurposing leftover rope as makeshift cushioning. Each man, it seems, arrived eventually at his own personal compromise between available space, total weight, and whatever rest he could realistically manage. What strikes you most, watching this scene unfold, is the complete absence of any real privacy anywhere aboard. There are no hidden corners here, no private chambers, no curtains drawn for modesty's sake. Every single man sleeps in full view of all the others, his snores, his restless twitching, his half-muttered words all shared openly with the entire crew. Intimacy in this setting becomes simply unavoidable. The usual boundary between individual and group dissolves almost entirely out here. The sea rocks the ship again, and you notice how the sleeping men shift automatically along with it, bodies sliding slightly across the worn planks, shoulders occasionally bumping together. Some stir faintly but never fully wake, long since accustomed to the motion. Their chosen sleeping spots seem selected less for comfort than for basic stability, wedged firmly against the mast, or braced tightly beside a sea chest, reducing the risk of being rolled carelessly across the deck like loose cargo with each incoming wave. And so the underlying question of exactly where and how these Norse sailors truly slept remains, in many ways, an open puzzle even now. Were woven mats genuinely common, or reserved only for wealthier crews aboard better-funded ships? Did makeshift hammocks ever actually exist in practice, or do they survive only as later, embellished invention? Historians continue to argue the point without full resolution. The sailors themselves, though, clearly cared little for any of this ongoing academic debate. They simply collapsed wherever their exhaustion allowed, transforming every available inch of bare deck into a grudgingly accepted bed for the night. The dark stretches on, but then something in the ship shifts subtly. The wind softens. The sea itself seems to hush, if only slightly. You sense a strange stillness settling in, the particular quiet that arrives just before dawn when the entire world seems to hold its breath for a moment before the light returns. Even the sailors around you stir differently now. Their sleep grows lighter. Limbs twitch faintly. Faces crease slightly, as though their bodies already sense some coming change in the air, long before conscious thought catches up. It is well established from Norse sagas and poetry that dawn itself carried real symbolic weight in this culture. The breaking of light was tied closely to renewal, to the world quietly beginning again each day. On land, dawn meant hearths rekindled, the household stirring back to life. At sea, it meant, more simply, the relief of having survived one more night. You watch the men roll gradually onto their backs, eyes still closed, but their breathing quickening slightly, as though their bodies already know that the sun is close, even before any actual light appears. A curious story preserved in Icelandic tradition claims that sailors once swore dawn itself carried a faint, almost musical hum, audible across the water as the very first light began creeping in. Perhaps this was pure imagination. Perhaps it was only the distant groan of shifting ice somewhere far off. But these men apparently believed it enough to whisper about it each following morning. You listen closely yourself now, and in the stillness, you find you can almost hear it too, some faint, barely audible tone riding just beneath the surrounding hush. Specialists disagree on how much real, restorative rest sailors actually gained during these final pre-dawn hours. Some argue this period brought only shallow, half-alert sleep, bodies already anticipating the coming call to rise. Others suggest that sheer accumulated exhaustion might instead push men into unusually deep sleep right before morning finally arrived. No firm conclusion exists either way, though the pattern in front of you now seems clear enough on its own. Men caught somewhere between sleep and waking, bodies reluctant to rise, minds already quietly turning outward toward the coming day. The ship itself feels different during this particular hour. The usual creaks and groans soften somewhat. Even the rats beneath the deck grow unusually still, as though respecting some unspoken threshold between night and day. The mast's steady creak lowers into something closer to a gentle groan, and the splash of waves against the hull grows correspondingly gentler, less menacing than before. The surrounding air itself seems to shift too, crisp still, but carrying now the faintest suggestion of warmth not yet fully delivered. A sailor near you opens his eyes briefly, gazes upward at the fading stars, then closes them again. Another mutters something quietly under his breath, perhaps a fragment of prayer, perhaps only reflex. Their faces remain pale, lined faintly with frost, and yet somehow calmer now than they appeared during the depths of the previous night. This particular hush seems to offer a brief, welcome reprieve, a momentary illusion of genuine peace. An unusual anecdote preserved in later folklore describes crews who apparently believed that dawn marked the moment when any lingering spirits finally slipped quietly away, no longer haunting the ship through darkness. If genuinely believed, this would have given the hour even greater meaning still, not simply the arrival of light, but the departure of whatever quiet dread had accompanied the night. You picture sailors rolling over with visible relief at this thought, convinced that whatever unseen presence had shadowed them through the darkness had finally abandoned the ship to daylight. The first pale streaks of morning light finally begin creeping slowly across the horizon, faint at first, but already enough to silver the distant edges of the sea. You notice the sailors shifting more actively now, stretching stiff arms, flexing numb toes, grumbling softly under their breath. None of them rise fully just yet, but the particular spell cast by night has clearly broken. Dreams scatter now like drifting mist, gradually replaced by the dull, familiar ache of another morning's chores. You draw your own imagined cloak closer, savoring these last remaining traces of calm. The hush before dawn, however fleeting, offers a rare gentleness aboard this otherwise punishing vessel. These men may never openly admit it, but perhaps this particular hour, more than any other, is the one they secretly treasure most: the stillness, the faint promise of warmth still to come, the fragile pause settling in just before the day's labor begins again in earnest. The eerie stillness, though, does not last. A low rumble begins building somewhere just at the edge of hearing. At first you mistake it for a lingering dream, but then the deck jolts sharply beneath you, and the wind lashes suddenly through the rigging with a sound closer to a scream than a gust. The storm has returned, and with its return, whatever fragile rest remained comes apart entirely. You feel the men around you stir immediately, not to rise gently, but to grab desperately at anything solid nearby: planks, sea chests, each other, as their small chance at further sleep dissolves instantly into the raw fury of the waves. Both saga descriptions and modern reconstructions confirm that storms breaking across the North Atlantic could arrive with startling, almost unbelievable speed. The shallow, agile Norse ships rode these waves the way a leaf might ride a rushing stream, but that same agility meant every man aboard felt each violent motion directly, without the buffer a heavier vessel might provide. To even attempt sleep under such conditions was nearly impossible. Survival in these moments demanded clinging tightly rather than dreaming. You grasp instinctively at the boards yourself, fingers already numb as fresh spray whips hard across your face. A curious passage preserved in a later saga mentions sailors who claimed they could sleep straight through even the worst storms, provided they wedged themselves tightly enough between cargo and hull. Perhaps a few, especially hardy souls, genuinely managed this, lulled into unconsciousness by sheer accumulated exhaustion. Most, though, likely lay awake through it all, eyes clenched shut, bodies repeatedly battered, as though the sea itself were determined to shake them loose entirely. Historians remain uncertain exactly how these crews balanced vigilance against rest during such violent conditions. Some argue that half the men stayed awake throughout, managing the sail and rigging by necessity, while the rest attempted whatever brief rest they could manage regardless of the chaos. Others believe storms simply suspended any real hope of sleep altogether until calmer waters finally returned. The lack of clear answers mirrors exactly what you observe now: men lying flat, not asleep, but simply enduring, bodies horizontal even while minds remain fully, unwillingly alert. The ship bucks violently beneath you, and you hear a sudden cry as one sailor slides hard across the wet deck, saved only when another man lunges and seizes his arm just in time. Both collapse together against the mast afterward, breathing ragged before huddling close, unwilling to risk moving again. Sleep here is entirely out of reach now, and yet even so, both men close their eyes, allowing sheer exhaustion to drag them towards some kind of half-conscious awareness despite the surrounding danger. An unusual anecdote preserved in later folklore describes one sailor who apparently claimed his most vivid dreams always arrived during the worst storms, insisting the roar of wind and water transformed itself, in his mind, into the voices of the old gods, speaking to him in riddles only he could fully understand. His companions reportedly dismissed this as simple madness. And yet it's easy enough to imagine how noise this overwhelming might blur, eventually, into something indistinguishable from pure imagination. Perhaps, in some strange way, storms like this force dreams even upon men who had no intention of sleeping at all. The full sensation of the storm engulfs you now. The boards slam repeatedly beneath your body like some enormous drum. Salt spray stings sharply at your eyes. The wind tears violently at every cloak in reach, whipping the fabric hard enough against exposed skin that it feels almost like being struck with a whip directly. Each incoming wave lands with the weight of solid stone, and the ship groans loudly enough that it seems, for one heart-stopping moment, close to splitting apart entirely. The men cling tightly to whatever timber they can reach, muttering prayers, curses, or simply nothing at all. And yet, despite the surrounding terror, a few still manage to surrender briefly to pure exhaustion. You notice one sailor slumped heavily against a sea chest nearby, head lolling loosely, mouth hanging open in apparent defiance of the raging storm around him. His hands, even so, remain locked tightly around the wood, muscles clearly still tensed even in this half-sleep. Another lies flat nearby, cloak plastered wet against his body from the constant spray, and yet his eyes stay closed, his breathing somehow steady despite everything happening around him. The body, it seems, will find rest exactly when it absolutely must, even while the surrounding sea rages on regardless. For most of the crew, though, genuine sleep remains entirely shattered. They lie awake in the darkness, bodies shaking, ears filled completely with the storm's continuous roar. They are, in this moment, essentially captives of the weather itself, unable to fight it directly, unable to rest properly, caught instead somewhere in between until the storm's fury finally passes on its own. Their exhaustion deepens by the minute, nerves fray visibly. And still, somehow, they endure, because there is genuinely no other option available to them. The storm continues tearing through the remaining hours of night, but beneath all of it, one underlying truth becomes increasingly clear. Sleep, for these Norse sailors, was never something guaranteed. Sometimes the sea permitted it freely, lulling men gently with its steady rhythm. Other times it denied rest completely, replacing any hope of dreams with pure, unfiltered terror instead. Tonight clearly falls into the second category. And you, clinging alongside these exhausted men, share fully in their forced insomnia, simply waiting now for dawn to bring, not comfort exactly, but at the very least, continued survival. The storm drifts away with the same suddenness with which it arrived, leaving the ship soaked through and trembling, its crew even more so. Sleep has been stolen from nearly everyone tonight, and yet exhaustion refuses to loosen its grip regardless. You watch men sag where they sit, heads nodding forward against their will, eyelids growing impossibly heavy. When they finally do collapse again into something resembling rest, dreams arrive quickly this time, strange, fleeting comforts snatched from the middle of genuine misery. These rare, gentle dreams become something like treasure out here, brief escapes from a world otherwise made entirely of cold wood and endless, grinding waves. Both archaeological evidence and surviving literary tradition suggest that dreams held genuine significance for people of this era. The sagas are filled with visions interpreted as omens, warnings, sometimes even promises of things yet to come. But not every dream carried such weighty meaning. Some, it seems, were simply the desperate mind's own quiet gift, offering warmth and food where neither could be found in the waking world. You watch one sailor's face soften faintly as he sleeps, an expression you haven't seen cross his features at all while awake. Perhaps in his dream, he feels the glow of a hearth fire, or tastes fresh bread rather than the same tough, salted fish that sustained him for weeks. A curious account preserved within saga tradition describes a warrior who reportedly admitted, once safely home, that he sometimes longed for battle specifically within his dreams, not for any glory it might bring, but simply because dream fighting made him feel warm, his blood racing pleasantly through frozen limbs. Imagine finding relief even in visions of violence, purely because the imagined adrenaline briefly thawed a body otherwise locked in constant cold. You find yourself wondering what other strange comforts might have surfaced in the minds of men, so thoroughly starved of both warmth and rest. Experts differ meaningfully in how they interpret these dream escapes. Some argue they were nothing more than ordinary byproducts of fatigue and hunger, the mind simply filling gaps left by physical deprivation. Others insist these visions were more deeply woven into the surrounding culture itself, reinforcing shared ideals around hearth, kinship, and quiet courage. The lack of full agreement hardly seems to matter, though, as you watch the men in front of you now, bodies twitching faintly, lips murmuring half-formed words, faces briefly glowing with something like genuine peace. All of it stands as reasonably convincing proof that dreams offered these sailors a sanctuary the sea itself could never provide. A sailor beside you groans softly, then sighs in what sounds like real relief, as though something pleasant has just unfolded somewhere behind his closed eyes. Another stirs and murmurs a name, a woman's name, though you can't quite make it out before drifting deeper still into sleep. Their breathing evens out gradually. Their limbs loosen. For what feels like the first time in several nights, their collective rest looks, from where you kneel, almost genuinely peaceful. The ship continues rocking beneath them. The planks remain damp and unforgiving as ever. But within their private dreams, it seems, the entire world has shifted somehow, softened at the edges. An unusual piece of folklore claims that sailors sometimes discovered upon waking that they had all dreamed something remarkably similar the night before. Perhaps this was pure coincidence. Perhaps it reflected simply the shared environment shaping each man's imagination along similar lines, identical sounds, identical smells, working themselves independently into parallel visions. You picture these same weathered sailors laughing quietly together at dawn, realizing they'd each dreamed separately of bread baking, or of children's laughter drifting somewhere nearby, and feeling, if only briefly, a little less isolated out here on the open water. The sensations of their dreaming feel almost palpable even to you, an outside observer drifting through this imagined night. You feel warmth where none genuinely exists, the faint illusion of solid, dry earth beneath you instead of damp, salt-crusted planks. Something faintly sweet lingering on your tongue, though no such thing has actually touched it. It's fragile, and it doesn't last, but in the moment itself, it feels more real, somehow, than the cold gnawing steadily at your toes. Dreams, of course, change nothing about the sea itself, but they clearly change something in the sleeper, however briefly, however incompletely. Not every vision arriving tonight proves kind, of course. You notice one sailor jerk suddenly awake, his face twisted tight with obvious fear. He mutters something incoherent, perhaps reliving some past raid gone wrong, or picturing the sea itself rising up to swallow the ship whole. Nightmares, too, are clearly part of this same bargain. And yet even then, once he wakes shivering and gasping for breath, he has at least rested a little, if only in scattered fragments. There's a strange paradox buried in that thought. In a place where rest itself is this scarce, even bad dreams seem preferable to none at all. At the very least, they prove the body genuinely managed true sleep for a moment, however brief. At the very least, they show the mind finding some way to escape reality, however twisted the resulting vision turned out to be. You close your own eyes alongside them now, and for a fleeting instant, you too feel warmth brush faintly against your face. You catch, or imagine you catch, the scent of fresh bread. You hear, somewhere at the edge of perception, something close to laughter. The sea itself can offer none of this directly, but the mind, it seems, always finds a way regardless. And that, in the end, is precisely how these Norse sailors endured such crossings at all, by treasuring, however briefly, whatever comfort their dreams managed to offer, holding onto each fragment as though it were made of gold. The brief comfort of dreams lingers faintly as dawn stretches wider across the horizon, but not every sailor rests peacefully through these final hours. You sense a different kind of unease rippling through some of the men now, eyes darting faintly beneath closed lids, mouths murmuring words that sound less like prayer and more like warning. When a few of them stir briefly awake, they whisper quietly to one another, not about bread or hearth fires this time, but about something stranger. Ghosts. Spirits said to wander across the open waves when the sea itself falls unnaturally quiet, and the sleeping mind grows most vulnerable to whatever might be listening in the dark. It is well known from both saga tradition and later folklore that Norse sailors often spoke openly of encounters with the unseen. To these men, the sea was never simply water. It was alive in its own right, unpredictable, occasionally haunted. When sailors slept out in the open, beneath nothing but stars and drifting cloud. It took very little imagination for shadows to seem to shift unnaturally, or for a distant sound to resemble a voice rather than wind. You picture one sailor jerking suddenly awake, entirely convinced some pale shape has just passed close beside his cloak. A curious account preserved in Icelandic legal writing describes sailors who apparently swore that drowned warriors sometimes climbed quietly aboard during the night, not to cause harm, but simply to sit silently among the sleeping crew. Their presence, in this belief, functioned as a kind of warning, a coming storm perhaps, or a raid destined to fail. Whether genuine hallucination brought on by exhaustion, or simply a tale embellished considerably once safely back on shore, it reveals something true nonetheless about how easily the tired mind can weave mystery into simple fatigue. Scholars remain divided on how literally these stories were actually believed at the time. Some argue they functioned mainly as campfire tales, gradually exaggerated across generations of retelling. Others insist that sailors genuinely feared spectral visitors, and that the total absence of daylight combined with the ship's constant rocking motion likely blurred the line between waking perception and outright dream more than we might assume today. Watching the crew around you now, eyes wide in the half-dark, you begin to understand just how thin that particular boundary must have felt in practice. You watch one sailor stir, clutching an amulet tight against his chest, lips moving faintly around some name you cannot quite make out. Another pulls his cloak higher, covering even the top of his head, as though hiding deliberately from some set of unseen eyes. Their small, unconscious movements suggest a fear unrelated to cold or hunger, something imagined, or perhaps genuinely sensed, lingering quietly in the surrounding silence. An odd piece of folklore claims that some crews left small offerings out on deck before settling down each night, a few crumbs of bread, a drop of ale, occasionally a scrap of dried fish, set aside deliberately for whatever spirits might be prowling nearby. The gesture seems to carry equal parts superstition and quiet negotiation. Better, the thinking goes, to offer the ghost its small due than risk provoking its anger instead. You picture the men fumbling quietly with their own limited rations in the dark, murmuring softly as they set the offering down, then lying back afterward with hearts noticeably calmer. The whole atmosphere aboard shifts subtly under the weight of these shared beliefs. Every ordinary creak of timber now carries a faint edge of suspicion. Every flicker of moonlight across the water seems to hint at something more than simple reflection. Exhausted bodies continue clinging to whatever sleep remains available, even while their minds bristle faintly with unease. Some men twitch suddenly awake at nothing at all, convinced they've heard a voice somewhere close by. Others dream vividly of faces leaning in too close, only to wake sharply, hearts pounding. And yet still, they endure, half laughing come morning at their own fear, half genuinely convinced the spirits they sensed were entirely real. The sensations feel vivid even to you, drifting through this imagined night. You feel the faint weight of unseen eyes pressing against your back. The surrounding hush seems to thicken, as though something waits patiently just beyond the ship's low rail. The waves themselves seem quieter than before, the wind sharper, as if the world itself has conspired briefly to confirm every sailor's private fear. You draw your own cloak tighter, though it does nothing at all to push back the chill creeping in from somewhere deep within rather than from outside. And then, gradually, exhaustion wins out over fear as it always eventually does. The men settle back down, charms clutched tightly, cloaks drawn high, and dreams slowly return, whether filled with ghosts or with the warm glow of distant hearths. None among them can say for certain by morning. What matters in the end is simply that even haunted sleep remains sleep, and the body, regardless of what the mind fears, continues to demand it. You lie among them now, your own heart thudding faintly, ears straining for whispers you privately hope never to actually hear. The night remains long. The sea stays dark, and somewhere between plain reality and quiet imagination, you drift alongside them, uncertain, uneasy, but undeniably still here. The pale light of true morning finally creeps steadily across the deck. Frost clings to every plank still, glittering faintly as though the sea itself had dusted the entire ship overnight in scattered shards of glass. One by one, the sailors begin to stir from their broken, restless sleep. None of them rise particularly refreshed, far from it. Instead, they groan quietly, stretch stiff limbs slowly, and blink hard against the sharp morning air. The night has clearly left its mark on each of them. Aches settle deep in shoulders pressed too long against hard wood. Fingers remain numb from where they'd curled tightly around cold weapons through the night. Faces look drawn and tight from a night full of uneasy, fragmented dreams. We know from broader accounts of daily life at sea that Norse crews typically began each morning stiff and visibly sore. The total lack of proper bedding, the persistent damp of the planks, and the unrelenting cold together ensured that no man woke without at least some quiet complaint. Picture the resulting chorus, coughs rattling through tired chests, joints cracking audibly, half-hearted curses muttered under frosted breath as each man tries to coax some feeling back into his own stiff body. You can almost hear it now, a ragged, familiar symphony of discomfort greeting yet another difficult day. A curious note preserved in later saga tradition suggests that these morning complaints eventually became something close to ritual among the crew. Men reportedly compared, almost competitively, who had suffered worse through the night. One might claim, half-jokingly, that he'd frozen harder than anyone else aboard, while another countered that he alone had endured rats scurrying across his feet all night long. Grim humor, it seems, became the quiet salve these men used to help themselves face yet another demanding day. You smile faintly at the image, hardened warriors and traders grumbling together like tired old men, somehow finding genuine camaraderie buried within their shared aches. Not every historian agrees on exactly how much real, restorative rest these sailors actually managed to find between each difficult night. Some argue that their bodies gradually adapted, growing numb to the ongoing hardship over time. Others insist instead that this accumulated exhaustion only worsened steadily as the voyage continued, quietly eroding both health and morale the longer the crossing dragged on. The truth likely rests somewhere between these two positions, but the scene unfolding in front of you now suggests a fatigue that never fully lifts, no matter how many mornings pass. Each new dawn seems less about genuine renewal and more simply about dragging an exhausted body forward once again, one more difficult day at a time. You watch one sailor rub hard at his lower back, wincing visibly. Another flexes his stiff hands slowly, knuckles cracking audibly in the cold morning air. A third scratches irritably at his own scalp, muttering quiet curses at lice that had apparently tormented him even through his broken dreams. The individual complaints overlap steadily, forming a low, grumbling chorus that seems, oddly enough, to bind these men together rather than drive them apart. In shared discomfort, it seems, they find a strange kind of unity. An unusual anecdote preserved in folklore describes sailors joking that their own joints creaked noticeably louder each morning than the ship's timbers themselves. Listening now, you can almost hear the truth buried inside that small joke. This steady chorus of groans nearly matching the low groan of the wood shifting beneath your own feet. Both ship and crew alike seem thoroughly worn down by the long night just past, tested equally by its endless demands. The smell of morning here carries its own distinct character, stale sweat dried into damp wool, the faint sourness of unwashed breath, mixed unmistakably with the lingering scent of rodents somewhere nearby. And yet beneath all of that, something sharper cuts through as well, clean salt air, carrying with it the simple, undeniable promise of daylight. The men slowly pull themselves upright, cloaks dragging heavily, and begin working through slow, deliberate stretches, movements clearly sluggish but necessary all the same, each one coaxing blood gradually back into limbs gone numb overnight. Despite the steady stream of complaints, no one lingers too long over their own discomfort. Survival, as always, demands immediate action regardless of how tired anyone feels. Weapons are checked over carefully, ropes are inspected for overnight damage, sails are adjusted as needed for the day's sailing, And yet, even as this familiar routine resumes, the low mutters about the previous night's misery continue quietly alongside it. Who among them had suffered the worst dream? Whose cloak had ended up wettest by morning? Whose toes had gone the most alarmingly numb overnight? It becomes, in its own small way, a kind of shared ritual, the particular way these men manage to stitch themselves back together each morning before the day's real labor begins. You crouch quietly among them, feeling something like your own shoulders ache faintly, your own back sore from a night spent against hard, unforgiving planks. The discomfort feels entirely real, but so too, unmistakably, does the sense of quiet camaraderie running steadily beneath it. In their shared groans and complaints, there's clear proof of genuine endurance. Each man has survived one more difficult night, and by openly voicing his particular share of that suffering, he seems, in some small way, to declare a quiet victory over it. And so morning here begins not with any real cheer, but instead with grumbling, careful stretching, and the slow, grudging acceptance of yet another demanding day ahead. Their aches function almost like quiet badges of honor. Their muttered complaints form a steady chorus of resilience. You rise alongside them now, weary yourself, and yet still moving forward, carried by that same stubborn, shared will to simply keep going. The groans of morning gradually settle as the day hardens fully into daylight. Cloaks are shaken out and redraped over shoulders. Weapons are strapped back into place at each man's side. The crew resumes its familiar positions along the ship, and yet, looking around the deck now, you sense something deeper running beneath the ordinary routine of it all. These nights of cold, of damp, of restless half-sleep have quietly bound this crew together in ways no single storm or battle ever could. Enduring bonds, forged not through glory, but through hardship shared night after night. It is clear enough from surviving saga tradition and the broader historical record that Norse crews placed enormous value on loyalty and brotherhood. Survival at sea demanded nothing less. But beyond any formal oaths sworn or battles fought side by side, it was these long nights of shivering together, of scratching at the same lice, of clutching weapons through half-formed dreams, that forged connections every bit as strong as iron. You see it clearly now in the small, unconscious gestures around you, one man nudging another gently awake for his watch, quiet laughter shared over some familiar complaint, the silent, unquestioned trust that allows one man to sleep soundly while another keeps watch nearby. A curious anecdote preserved in later Icelandic storytelling describes a crew who, years after their voyage had ended, could apparently still recall every small detail of each other's sleeping habits. Who among them snored loudest, who muttered prayers under his breath, who kicked out sharply in his sleep without ever quite waking. They are said to have remembered all of it with genuine laughter, transforming what had once been shared misery into something closer to cherished memory. That kind of intimacy, born entirely out of hardship, seems to have become, in its own quiet way, part of who these men understood themselves to be. Scholars remain uncertain whether such bonds genuinely lasted well beyond the voyage itself, shaping communities once these men returned home. Some argue that crews likely disbanded fairly quickly, each man returning to his own farm, his own family, his own separate life. Others believe these particular friendships, forged specifically at sea, endured for a lifetime, echoed afterward in the sagas and poetry these same men helped pass down. The lack of any firm certainty leaves plenty of room for imagination here. But watching this weary crew now, standing shoulder to shoulder in the morning light, you find yourself leaning toward the latter possibility. Shared suffering, it seems, has its own particular way of outlasting distance and time alike. These men now stand together, not merely as raiders or traders bound by a single voyage, but as something closer to brothers, forged specifically through a string of sleepless, difficult nights. The cold taught each of them real dependence on the others. The persistent damp demanded a kind of patience few would have chosen willingly. The long, uneasy silences forced a level of trust that likely took years to build under ordinary circumstances on land. Even the rats, the lice, The endless restless dreams became something like common enemies, quiet battles fought together, without need for any weapon at all, using nothing but sheer collective endurance. An unusual detail preserved in folklore suggests that some sailors carved small runes directly into the planks where they habitually slept, marking that particular spot as their own for the duration of the voyage. Long after the crossing itself ended, those small carved marks reportedly remained, quiet signatures left behind by men who had survived, night after night, side by side. You run your own hand lightly across the nearby boards, half expecting to feel some faint trace of scratching left by tired, patient hands. Even if no mark genuinely remains, the idea itself lingers pleasantly, a quiet reminder that these particular nights were never entirely forgotten by the men who lived through them. The ship creaks forward steadily now, and the crew begins shaking off the last of their shared weariness. And yet the memory of everything endured together clearly lingers on in their voices, their easy laughter, the brief glances passed quietly between them. They know exactly what they've survived together, and that shared knowledge becomes its own quiet kind of treasure. Gold eventually fades. Silver tarnishes with time. But the memory of surviving long, difficult winter nights together at sea becomes something else entirely. A story passed down afterward, told and retold for generations. You close your own eyes for a moment, feeling yourself woven quietly into that same brotherhood. You too have lain against damp, unforgiving planks tonight. You too have scratched absently at some imagined itch, breathed frost carefully into the surrounding dark. You too have listened as half-remembered songs faded gradually into scattered dreams, felt small charms clutched tightly against unnamed fears, heard quiet laughter chasing away the worst of the night's unease. You too have endured these same long hours, and now, alongside this weary crew, you rise gently into whatever comes next. These particular bonds, woven entirely from shared hardship, would go on to echo through halls and firesides for generations afterward. They would be told not only through the grand sagas of raids and open battle, but through quieter stories too, how these men truly survived their nights at sea, their closeness with one another, their shared complaints, their sheer stubborn will to keep sleeping, keep waking, keep simply moving forward. The nights themselves were cruel unquestionably, and yet somehow, out of that same cruelty, they built something enduring, a brotherhood every bit as lasting as the sea that had tested it so thoroughly. The story now begins to soften, drifting gently toward its close. Imagine the ship still rocking slowly beneath you, the sea murmuring quietly against its sides. The men around you are no longer restless, shivering figures scratching at lice or clutching weapons through uneasy half-sleep. They have become, instead, something softer, shadows slowly fading into memory, their hardships gently carried away now on the tide. Let your own breathing slow, matching the steady, unhurried rhythm of the waves. Picture these same sailors, safely returned to shore at last, cloaks finally drying properly beside a real, glowing fire, voices grown softer, laughter gentler now, no longer edged with exhaustion. The particular bond they built together endures on, quietly, even as the sharpest edges of their suffering finally begin to fade, tucked away carefully, like a story meant only for the quiet hours of night. Let these images grow steadily more distant now. The frost that once bit so sharply at frozen fingers slowly melts away entirely. The lice that once crawled persistently into every seam of damp will simply vanish. Whatever ghosts, whatever half-imagined whispers once drifted near the ship, fade quietly along with the thinning mist. What remains, in the end, is only the quiet, steady strength of men who somehow endured it all, and the deep sense of calm left behind now that their long story has finally reached its close. Breathe slowly, in and out, as though gently rocked by that very same cradle of the sea. Feel the weight of your own blankets around you now, not damp, not heavy, but warm, steady, entirely your own. Let the distant creak of the ship soften gradually into nothing more than the quiet hum of your own breathing. The voyage at last is finished. The story has reached its end. The sailors rest now, and so, gently do you, close your eyes. Let yourself drift a little deeper. And let the quiet carry you the rest of the way. Sweet dreams.